G'day bird nerds, I'm Grant. I'm a bird nerd. This is the Bird Emergency. I've got to say I'm really stoked today to be speaking with someone that I've followed on Twitter and been astounded by the just the volume of output in terms of papers and media appearances that that this person does. If you're in the UK and indeed the northern hemisphere, you will probably know this person if you follow any of the environment / conservation press in that part of the world. I think I've got it right. About 15 years experience working in South America. We've got the reader in biodiversity, conservation biologist, Dr. Alexander Ways.
Hi, Grant.
G'day, Alex. How are you, mate?
I'm great, thanks. And you? Thanks for the invitation to come on here and chat to your viewers.
Look, I'm really stoked that you could come on, and there's so many things to talk to you about, and I'll sort of introduce how we're going to frame the discussion because there is so much of it. So we're going to talk about extinction denialism. We're going to talk about how with the advances in genetics and the techniques available to taxonomists, biologists, that we're now discovering more new species than at almost any time ever before in the history of human civilization, except perhaps that boom period where all the great powers of the world at that time were rushing out on their colonial expansion, and there were people closely following behind the conquerors with shotguns and sketchbooks and describing new species. But now we've got revisions and we've got just new species, new taxa being discovered as a result of blood work, and also recording, audio recording, which allows more differentiation between populations, resulting in more ticks for twitchers if you're a mad twitcher. And then we're going to try and move the discussion into the astounding State of the World's Birds report, of which Alex was the lead author, which is now, what is it now? It was first released sort of pre-pub in May, wasn't it? May last year. So how long until the next one is coming out?
Well, so that was in. I guess there are several organisations that produce, like NGOs that produce similar reports. So BirdLife International produces one, I think every year or so, and there's a similar one for North America. But yeah, this was a one-off academic review, essentially, with a similar title, but actually including a lot of the authors of the NGO reports as well. I thought, who better than to be writing this for me and the people that are collating this information over a long period. So.
Yeah, I've got the BirdLife one that we can reference a bit later. If you haven't seen or heard of the State of the World's Birds report before, I would encourage you, if you are not into reading academic papers, I would encourage you to have a look at the BirdLife International site and pull it up, because they've got a lot of really great interactive graphs on that. But anyway, that's the next part of the chat. And then finally, we're going to talk about whether feeding wildlife, or shall we say, Alex, the academic term, provisioning, general provisioning of wildlife, is helping or harming biodiversity conservation. I've been a little bit lax with the terminology there, but it's such a big topic, and we'll try and bring that back to some of the discussions we've had on this show earlier. Alex, first let's have a little bit of an examination of your career and your early career. How did your position? You're based at Manchester Metropolitan University, but you spent years working in Amazonia, the South American jungle. How did you get to where you are now in academic progression?
Yeah, so I've sort of been interested in birds since I understood that birds were dinosaurs, basically. So I sort of went through a dinosaur phase as like a 5 and 6 year old, then got into birds after that, and then have been a lifelong birder. So then my sort of choice of undergrad degree was to do biology at UEA, University of East Anglia in Norwich, which sort of at the time had, and still does have a very, at the time one of the best rated ecology courses in the country, and now still has a very, very good ecology course. And I did a year in North America for my undergrad degree, and a friend there had sent me the ABA, American Birding Association's Opportunity for Birders catalogue. And so I received this just after having finished my undergrad degree when I was back at UEA. And within that, there was this opportunity to be a volunteer guide at a lodge in South America in the Amazon basin. So I ended up sort of going out, spending 3 or 4 months at this lodge, and sort of learned the birds of the southern Amazon. And then sort of serendipitously again, rather, sort of fell into a PhD project with Carlos Perez, because he just started working in the region. He had someone work on the mammals. So I ended up sort of doing a PhD looking at the impacts of forest fragmentation and the importance of riparian corridors on bird and mammal species. So that was 3 years of my life, sort of from 2004 or so to 2006, well, 2008, I think, in the end. And then a couple of years out, sort of doing consultancy and expeditions, and ended up moving sort of permanently to Brazil. I worked at the Museu Paraense Miliogeology, the Geldi Museum in Belém, which is sort of on the mouth of the River Amazon. Spent 5 years there, then did a year at Cornell on their Edward B. Rose postdoc fellow scheme, and then sort of landed a permanent academic job back here in the UK at Manchester Met.
So, have you got a favourite taxonomic group? Are you a bird nerd? Are you a mammal nerd? Or
I've always been a colossal bird nerd. I do look at everything else, and as birders in the UK want to do, for a long time, I've sort of been able to identify Odonata. We haven't got very much in the UK, right? We're sort of a northern latitude country with very depauperate island fauna and flora, so it's not that difficult to sort of get your head around a lot of the groups here. Although subsequent to that, I sort of got really into iNaturalist in the last few years, and they've ended up literally photographing everything from slime molds to everything else, although heavily reliant on the community and AI to get me to identifications. But fundamentally, I'm a very, very keen birder.
Can't let a reference to iNaturalist go by without plugging coming up in November, the Great Southern BioBlitz. So if you are a keen observer of nature and you have a camera, you can be involved in the Great Southern BioBlitz if you're down this end of the world, of the globe. Alex, being a bird nerd and being from the northern climes where a chiff-chaff is an amazing bird, and that you are able to delight in the song of the common blackbird without feeling a tang of anger that it's displacing so many of our other birds. Were you a bird nerd kid?
I was, yeah. So I I was really into fossils first off. I mean, from literally the age of like 6, and then, as I mentioned earlier on, when sort of the realization that you could essentially study dinosaurs in the field because they are birds, and I sort of got into birds sort of when I was 7 or 8. I sort of had a grandfather who was had a farm and had a sort of working knowledge of birds. And my other grandfather was a bit of a polymath and seemed to have books on everything. So I sort of fell into it that way. The information was there in front of me, and I was sort of lucky in an upbringing in quite a rural area, and parents who eventually took me wherever I demanded for every family holiday. So I'd certainly seen a lot of birds by the time I was getting to university, a lot more than my peers, and maybe saw fewer in the UK after that. But almost grown out of twitching by the time I was 18, I think.
Having worked in Brazil for and living there permanently for a while, and working in South America, are you fluent in Portuguese and Spanish?
I'm fluent in Portuguese, but not in Spanish. No, sort of working knowledge of Spanish. Get away with some Portuñol maybe, but I am certainly fluent in Portuguese. My Brazilian wife as well, and spent a long time out there. So,
that makes it easy to keep it up, then, doesn't it? While you're based back in Manchester. So,
sorry, I don't know that.
Thanks very much for that. I think that was Google. I've got a Google device here. I don't know why
gotcha.
It jumped in there.
The AI trying to intercept things.
Weird, very weird. Anyway, I was just going to do a joke, but let's leave that one behind. Let's move straight into this idea that there is a growing trend of decision makers or influences on decision makers who are intent on denying the speed of the extinction crisis that we are facing. Can you give us a bit of a background of what the extinction crisis looks like from your point of view, and who are the people driving the denialism?
So I guess the extinction crisis is multifactorial, right? We've got in species disappearing entirely. We've got local extinctions of species, and we've got declines in wider bioabundance. So, and we can also touch on this in the State of the Birds report, essentially. But what we've seen up to this point has mostly been extinctions of species on islands, although increasingly now a sort of a wave of extinctions of species on continents. But also the loss of bioabundance, the loss of abundance of many formerly common bird species. So various sort of facets to that, and including the associated loss of ecosystem services, etc. And then very, very different outcomes from different places. And again, not all species are declining. Some species are sort of winners in the Anthropocene and are doing quite well, but there's a lot more losers than winners out there, both amongst birds and amongst almost all taxonomic groups. So the denial, the sort of the idea to write this paper on sort of defining extinction denial, I guess it came off the back of seeing a lot of pushback in the media, quite a lot of that in the sort of quite extreme sort of right-wing media ecosystem here, but also in some sort of quite the sort of popular media as well, and broadsheets, like the Daily Telegraph here, etc. And there was a big pushback against a report by the IPBES, this sort of new sort of essentially kind of like the analogous to the big climate panel, basically this international panel for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And they produced a report on the sort of state of nature. And there was a particular attack that sort of looked at this figure of a million threatened species. There were various other angles to that, but people really sort of digging in at this hypothetical million threatened species figure, for instance, and then using that as a springboard to attack other messages associated with that press release. But I've also seen lots of similar sort of attacks on that information that have come from the media. There's been sort of some names have appeared quite frequently, but I've also seen it come from all sorts of places. And I think you wonder sometimes whether people sort of are aware of the sort of inaccuracies, or and are still pushing them, or if they're simply repeating untruth which have been sown elsewhere. But so fundamental challenge is sort of making people aware of the problems that the natural world faces, and understandable then, kind of just like the climate crisis. As soon as you recognize that, if we're going to fix this problem, then we have to have some changes, then there are obviously people with vested interest that don't want to see those changes. So that ecosystem of denial is probably similar across, most of these facets, where we have these, denial of vaccinations, or denial of climate change, or denial of all sorts of things that people will deny that's science related.
I want to come back to that, like who and why in a second, but I know it's difficult when we're having a discussion to talk about numbers, but we can focus on one part of the South American continent, which has been fairly well studied and is fairly well defined as as an ecological region, I think, and we're talking about the Atlantic forest of Brazil. Now, the amount of habitat loss of that region is astounding. There's only 12% of it left intact as the original sort of ecological unit. So if we model that over all of the other wilderness areas left in the world that are being affected and denuded at similar rates, I mean, Australia is just an example, and Africa. I mean, I think it's by 2050. I think the projection is that Africa will actually be home to 40% of the world's population. It's a really, really significant increase on what it is now. The growth of all of the just the urban areas means that we're going to lose habitat for all species. It's going to be happening in India, and if we continue, that every society starts to live the way that our societies, and we're talking about Northern European, the colonial outposts, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, if all of these other societies consume and expand in the way we have, the crisis that we have now for extinction is going to steamroll. So it's sort of two problems at once. But I think we can almost go back to who the actors are that are denying this, and what the reason is. Let me say, in general, Alex, do you think it's industries that that benefit from consumption that are denying it? I know that's really big, but then perhaps we can tackle whether or not there's a ability in our economic system to actually look further ahead and to see whether or not there is a cliff. I mean, are we really the proverbial lemmings in the system that we've created for ourselves? I know I'm probably asking you to be a philosopher here, but it's tied in a bit to eco growth, which we probably won't get into. But
yeah, that's quite an open-ended question, and it's almost like how do you solve conservation? And lots of threads I'd like to sort of pick up on there. I mean that crisscross a lot of the themes that we want to talk about. I think it's worth first off adding. I mean, people often see and sort of focus on sort of population increases in the global south as being the big driver, but ultimately it is consumption in the global north, and our sort of collective ecological footprints here are far higher and responsible for a lot of habitat change in the global south. So, for instance, in Amazonia, people often sort of trying to finger the little guy with a little, patch of manioc, and all these lots of little guys with little patches of manioc. But much of the deforestation comes from very large capitalized farmers who are exporting produce to global north markets, for instance. So, and the little guys are producing rice and manioc and keepers and chickens for local consumption. So I think viewing actually, I mean, it's very easy for the global north to think to sort of say, well, it's a global south problem, but ultimately it's commodity flows which drive so much deforestation in the tropics, for instance. So I think that's very key, and I think it is really obviously a problem if everyone rises to the sort of level of that we have in the global north. That will be unsustainable, but it also requires us in the global north to probably take a hit and on what we're doing and lower expectations and needing to frame really the whole economic growth angle and look at different ways of embracing sort of human welfare, for instance, and these sort of questions, rather than just framing everything in terms of sort of acquisition of capital. So obviously there's only a finite amount of growth possible on a finite planet, and I think the sooner sort of go on.
Oh, sorry, Alex. I just wanted to make sure that people understood that was really the point that I was making, is that I'm not attaching blame to people in the global south. I'm continually frustrated, and I heard a discussion on the radio here where the National Farmers Federation president being interviewed by a bunch of friendly journos, the agriculture or rural press club, I can't remember exactly what they called themselves, and the NFF president was bemoaning that the government might sign a free trade treaty with Europe at the moment because one of the conditions from Europe is that there's going to be high tariffs associated with products that are derived from recently cleared land. Now, we can't afford to clear any more intact habitat here, just like most places. But there was not any conversation about why are we clearing more land when we've already got so much cleared land. But there's this push and this refusal to understand that intensive agriculture exhausts soils. So you must get some more. It's cheaper to knock it down than it is to replenish existing soils. So sorry, I just
I didn't think you thought that, but that is something actually that comes up all the time with the denial as well, because it's sort of a form of implicatory denial and saying, oh no, the problem's over there. But I mean, ultimately, and through a good example of that, for instance, like populations of various large carnivores in Europe have increased in recent years, things like wolves and bears. So some people, again, in the right-wing media ecosystem, will sort of hold that up and say, look, this is like an environmental Kuznets curve. It's like as countries industrialize, then they get better at looking after their fauna and flora. But that's actually not what's happened. It's because land has been abandoned in large parts of Europe, because we're actually getting our produce from further afield. We're importing soy or beef from South America because it's cheaper, and it's a consequence of globalization. So it's obvious that not all countries can then do that, because we'll reach a point where we're going to produce enough food for 8.5 billion people. So just as you said, like in the Amazon, so much deforestation is just speculation. People cut down the forest because it's worth more when it's unforested, basically, when there's nothing left there. So it makes sense. It makes economic sense to cut the forest down and sit on it until that land accrues more money. People just put a load of these big white Brahman cows on it. You've got a couple of ranch hands, and you can make some money whilst waiting for the soybean magnates to arrive in your region, for instance. So, and then there's vast amounts of land which is, in not generating much, of anything. Sort of partially abandoned, occasionally cleared. You could easily intensify agriculture there or rewild that land, but we just, it's this fundamental question: what is land for? And we're so bad as a species at sort of doing what would make most sense to both sort of facilitate economic development, but to make sure we retain biodiversity and the crucial ecosystem services which keep us alive.
At the risk of broadening the topic, I'll just make a make a comment too, is that nearly all of the parts of the world where this is happening, the privilege of people to be able to make these decisions, and that the accumulated wealth and the power that goes along with it, as a result of dispossession of people as part of various colonial projects. And I get really frustrated that the denialism, apart from denying, and I promise everyone, we will keep going down that thread, that denying that the extinctions are actually happening at the rate that is being contended. But there doesn't seem to be any ability in the global north, and I'm going to include Australia and New Zealand in that, just because the societies are fairly reflective of what's going on in Europe and America. There just seems to be no ability to reflect on how we got here, what we owe the planet, but also what we owe the dispossessed owners of these lands, traditional owners of these lands. And even before talking about the idea of reparations, at least we owe them the health of the environment that they continue to live in. I mean, that's the very least that we owe. And it seems to me that the whole conversation, climate change, extinction denialism, is really tied up in the inability to look at our own societies and the roots of our own societies, and the continued overconsumption in our own societies. And I don't know, it kind of feels a bit like chicken and the egg kind of thing too. What do you think about that perspective? If you can drill it back to who is denying the extinction crisis.
I think so. Fundamentally, it is those people. Well, who the mouthpiece for it are journalists, and in many cases associated with media ecosystems, which are typically right wing and typically interested in maintaining the status quo fundamentally, and many of those sort of right wing ecosystems are funded by powerful people with then a vested interest in maintaining that status quo. I guess when we sort of talk about the sort of anti-colonial movements, then science has sort of been catching up with that, and especially the sort of the conservation literature has been catching up that recently, and the sort of an increasing awareness that this sort of narrative about sort of wilderness as being areas without people has also been sort of shut down a little bit, because we're increasing awareness that the native indigenous people in a lot of these tropical regions have been obviously much more successful at maintaining biodiversity than a lot of the people that replace them, for instance. So movements to empower indigenous communities to do conservation, is showing sort of increasingly good results, essentially. So continuing to empower those people seems pretty fundamental to solving this sort of the entwined biodiversity and climate crises.
In Australia, that I think some of the mouthpieces are not so much as denying the extinction crisis, but are just not acknowledging it. And I mean, I consume more than I would like of things like we've got the Sunrise program here, and the Today Show, Breakfast TV, the national broadcaster has one. Animals in the environment tend to occupy the here's a cute furry animal space, or here's our reporter at at an amazing zoo where they've got where someone's got another fluffy animal or those kind of stories. And there's never a real reflection on what the real state of affairs is. But I wouldn't call those outlets right-wing. Like, it's not...
No.
But there's a right-wing slant, I mean, because they are controlled by that. But I think it's even more fundamental than right or left. I just don't think that people are prepared to... I mean, the news was out this week that the western ice shelf of Antarctica, which is gone... I mean, about 18 months ago or 2 years ago, I think there was some hope that it might return at some stage. But now the news is out, no, it's gone. Those water level rises are locked in. They're never coming back. But I haven't heard anyone say, so the penguins, you're stuffed. I haven't heard any media anywhere except one story on BBC World. I haven't heard it in, like, the main Western media. Are you giving the label of right wing to all of these sort of mainstream outlets?
No, I wouldn't say that. So I think there's two different things talking about here. There's the sort of denial side, which is a taxonomy of that. Maybe we can go on to talk about that a bit later on.
Please. Yeah.
And then there's what the media focus on, which is a different question and is in many ways a different problem. So a few years ago, we had this sort of Amazonian fires crisis, which in the eyes of the media, it's this one event, right? But actually, it's been going on before, and it was even worse the next year. But we had COVID, and again, media attention drifts, right? Because people get tired, seemingly, or things can't precipitate. Because the news cycles are normally punctual events rather than this slow problem. And climate change, biodiversity loss are just ongoing problems that people just forget about, or whatever, essentially. And especially if it's not affecting the lives of the readers directly, then it doesn't attract attention. So that's one challenge. Another challenge is the focus you talk about on the cute furry animal, and I guess it's sort of most people don't have an ecological education, and they can sort of understand bad man shoots animal, but they can't really understand the sort of consequences of losing millions of hectares of habitat or degrading it, and the concept of this big change, right? Because it's changing habitats, and people don't really understand that, and even the people that present that information in the media tend to be arts graduates and not science graduates. So maybe there's an issue with communication there. That was something that's come up. I did a little bit of work at the BBC, and that was people coming to me to tell me that they thought that might have been sort of a weakness. And I guess there's an expectation that people aren't interested in habitats or they need a face, they need an identifiable victim, they need to see, this is the koala with its feet burnt, and that captures the public imagination in a way that's showing them a satellite image of, hundreds of square kilometers of habitat gone that doesn't do. So I definitely think that there's challenges there with how we communicate these crises, and that's apart from the other people that were saying these crises don't exist, or that are saying, well, they do exist, but this is the reason why, or they're saying, oh, they do exist and this is why, but we need to do this rather than we need to do that. So they are sort of separate issues, and I say it's more predominant on the right-wing media, but maybe that's only a function of who controls that media and their agendas. And sometimes you see some of the things on the left, I think, but not to the same extent, perhaps.
Well, maybe we can put those two situations in two buckets, because there's the hard line extinction denial, which is the rebuttal of reports and that kind of information, and then there's the bit that I brought up, which I call the soft sort of denial, and it's really, really general in that Australia is a country that, by any measure of common sense, should not be looking to expand its beef production, both for the use of water and the degradation of the habitat, and from the health that we know about. And we shouldn't be looking to now to be getting people who are not eating beef as their main source of protein. We shouldn't be trying to expand that, but we're unable to look back
Yeah.
that. But let's
Well, I can.
Sorry, I'd like you to give us some examples of the actual extinction denialism that goes on, and the kind of methods that that people who want to deny what seems to be the blooming obvious.
Sure. So
how do they do it?
So a good one to actually links back to what we first talking about a while ago with the Atlantic forest, which is something that a system I've done a bit of work on. We've published some papers on taxa which haven't been seen for a long time, and some species that are definitely extinct, and other species which are going extinct. Now, you mentioned earlier on that we sort of lost almost all of it's gone. Like 12, not all of it's gone. There's 12% or whatever left, and that's in variable size patches. There's quite a lot of it in tiny patches which are too small for species to survive, etc. And then some people have said that well, there's virtually nothing has disappeared from there. So ergo, people like Bjorn Lomborg, who wrote the book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, for instance, he sort of held that up and saying, look, we can actually lose almost all the habitat, like happened in the Atlantic forest, and nothing goes extinct, so it's fine. And that's sort of used as an open shut case that biodiversity scientists are over-egging this extinction crisis, and it's not a big thing. Or someone like Matt Ridley will come along and say, oh, yeah, the extinction crisis is a thing, happened on islands, and it's no longer happening, so don't worry about it, because that's, it's done, it's over. So coming back to Brazil, actually, we probably mismeasured the extinction crisis in the Atlantic forest, because, deforestation been happening there for a long time, 400 years, much longer than been happening in the Amazon, which has only really been kicking off since the 1970s. So, and we're still discovering new species in the Atlantic forest, through the 1980s and 1990s, 2000s, 2010s even. Now, these new species tend to be species which are incredibly rare, species only found in a tiny number of fragments, which have only recently been inventoried. One of those species, discovered by a really good friend of mine, Juan Marcel Barnett, who passed away before even the species could be officially described. In fact, like 2 days before I arrived to speak at a conference in northeast Brazil, where he was going to attend, and I've been even asking him about information to go and see these birds beforehand. But this species that he discovered, it was formally described after basically gone extinct. And by the same notion, it's likely that there were other species which scientists, again, never got to describe and, had already gone extinct. And we've got some sort of anecdotal evidence from old sort of documents and drawings that this colonial era people did before the advent of specimen preparation that seem to indicate that there were species which we don't have a name for and don't have a likeness for. And there are now species disappearing in the Atlantic forest. There's 6 or 7 examples of species which disappeared in recent years. There are lots of others which are down to like one bird in the case of Streisman's bristlefront. That's probably gone extinct in the last couple of years. No one seems to have seen it. Other things which are just hanging on, like cherry-throated tanager or Alagoas ant wren. There's half a dozen or so of both those species. They'll only survive with immediate conservation attention, probably only with captive breeding. People are trying to work out how to do that right now. And then lots of other species which long term their future isn't secure. So there's the combination of not having historical data and then an extinction debt which is slowly being paid for these species. So I don't think we can assume that A, we haven't lost quite a lot already, and B, we're not committed to lose a lot more unless we can turn things around pronto, basically. And that's the same is true of many tropical regions where we've had what Edward Wilson called years ago described as centenarian extinction. So there was this ridge I think it was in Ecuador, somebody can correct me later on, where some botanists found an early plant species, and then the whole area was deforested, and then no one had even done inventories of the animals. So he sort of called these centenarian extinctions for things that we probably lost but we'll never know about, basically. So some people like Lomborg picked up on that and said, okay, it's not a problem, here's the empirical evidence, but it's a misreading of that evidence, and really probably a knowing sort of misreading of that evidence. And another example might be something that Matt Ridley said, for instance. He's sort of saying, well, we can sort of tech fix our way out of this problem, and sort of really focusing only on islands as being the problem, or we could do gene drives, or we can do this, or we can do that. when really the big issue now is continental extinctions, and that's really tied to habitat extent and availability, which you can't directly. You're not going to. Some little fixes aren't fiddling around the edges isn't going to fix the problem there. We need sort of a big answer to this question of what is land for, and being much better at allocating it.
I just would like to let people know about that species that your friend Juan had discovered. That's the cryptic tree hunter, and that bird was very similar and perhaps mistaken for perhaps one of the great names in the bird world. I think that Alagoas is that the right way to pronounce it? The Alagoas foliage gleaner. I love the names that were trotted out here. There's something you mentioned, and this is where some of these deniers that you mentioned drive me a bit crazy, and also the people who are saying, "Oh, we can reanimate species now." Well, we're going to bring back the Tasmanian tiger. Ooh. An industry rush to put money into that technology. But there's technology now that allows us to discover species in a way that we couldn't before. And I'll ask you to mention what some of those techniques are. Here we go. The molecular analysis toolkits. But before we go there, don't some of these people who say, well, we haven't lost all the species, or we've still got these species in little bits, aren't they cognizant of the fact that the more we analyse different populations that at the moment are called one species, but we have a revision and then all of a sudden we've got 9 species and we lose 3. But going back to their baseline, they would say, "Oh, we haven't actually lost a species." How do these people consistently after 5, 10, 15 years continue to trot out the same argument for something which, I mean, if they accept science and the scientific method, they must pull their heads in, mustn't they?
Yeah, I guess it's almost like a taxonomy denial thing, if that's the case. Then I'm not sure I've seen that firsthand, although by implication it is problematic. And ultimately, we're a diurnal visual primate, right? And it's our ability to somehow judge what one species where one species starts and one species ends, and that has ended up always been based for us, and typically by some old white men in a museum looking at a tray of dead birds in front of them. And as you say, this sort of this use of new toolkits, new taxonomy, has quite fundamentally changed our understanding of how many birds there are out there, and by definition how many of everything else there are. And I think I always tell my students, a good example of that, I mean, sort of Britain is incredibly depauperate for biodiversity in general, both because we've been changing land uses for a very long time, and important in a way when I talk about this is to make sure I don't go on too many asides here at once. But talking about in Amazonia, you've got an old farmer who says, vocês devastaram sua terra 4,000 anos atrás. You cut down your forest 4,000 years ago. I'm like, yeah, sorry, that was a mistake. But then he's like, porque vocês now replantaram tudo? How come you didn't restore everything like you're expecting us to? So I think there's an interesting sort of thinking about what we should be doing and how we should leading. But anyway, UK is depauperate both because of this history of extinction, but also because it's a north temperate latitude, etc. But we've got like 17 species of bats or so. Our commonest species used to be like common pipistrelle. It was only in 1995 we realised that was 2 species. Like literally one of our commonest mammal species on an island doesn't have many mammals. And also species also goes throughout Western Europe as well. But anyway, we realised there were 2 species. There was one soprano pipistrelle and the common pipistrelle, and they look morphologically very, very similar. Apparently, bat workers could even notice they felt a bit different. It's like the sort of scratch and sniff test to mammal identification. But with the acoustic revolution, people realised they were echolocating at a different frequency. And then you look to the genetics, these things are separated long, long ago. So you think if in the UK and in Western Europe we only realise one of our commonest mammals is 2 species, you think about the rest of the tree of life and how suddenly using these other data sets changes our opinion. And ultimately we don't perceive the world the way that bats do, and to think that how one species recognises another is just based on the colour and size of that bat turned out to be a wholly inadequate way of measuring biodiversity. So in the Amazon in recent years, we've seen what some people call taxonomic inflation. It sounds a bit negative, really, as if that's a bad thing. But fundamentally, we've been looking at some of these polytypic species, where you have a species with lots of different subspecies, and rather than just being reliant on the morphology, the plumage and the number of stripes or bars or color patches or whatever it is, people have started using vocal data, so sound recordings, and they've started matching those with DNA. And for many lineages where there's a very little small difference in the plumage, they turned out to have very, very different songs and very, very different genetics. So basically, in many cases, when you cross from one large Amazonian river to the next, and these large Amazonian rivers are major barriers for dispersal of many bird species. You think of birds as being really hyper dispersive, and that's true of a lot of places in Australia, but not all species. Think about log runners or whatever, but certainly in arid environments where species must move. But then you think about in Amazonia, you've got these understory bird species which can scarcely fly. They sort of fly to get off the ground and not get eaten by an ocelot or whatever, but they're not moving or flying much during the day, so they certainly can't fly 4 kilometers across a major river, for instance. So these rivers have become barriers to dispersal, but there's been strong ecological pressures for the plumage of these things to continue looking similar. A brown cryptic bird on the understory, so you don't get, predators aren't seeing you, but the voice is totally different. And what's more, they don't recognize each other. And then when you look at the genetics, there's not been any, interbreeding between these species. And even that doesn't occur when the ranges meet in the headwater regions where the rivers narrow. They're still behaving as biological species. So sort of recent research has shown we sort of fundamentally mismeasured biodiversity in Amazonia. And this research has really been driven, a lot of it, by institutions in the global south. So I worked at the Geldy Museum, and I was doing conservation biology there, but I spent most of my time hanging out with taxonomists and even was an author on a description of one new species of scythebill, which sort of came out of this polytypic complex, all these different species, each from the Amazonian interfluve, and you ended up splitting it into 4 different species. And that sort of pattern repeats itself ad infinitum. And suddenly, instead of one big species we're not worried about because, the Western Amazon will be fine, you suddenly got species in each of these areas. And in the southeast of the Amazon, well, that's where, we've got really big problems of very little forest left in some of these, what we call interfluvial regions between rivers.
And that sort of raises the ethical question that we tend to brush over. And certainly every time there's a revision of a complex group, and that you then end up with multiple species that, if you look in your 15-year-old bird book, didn't exist, or plant field guide, or whatever herp text you want to have when you're out identifying lizards or snakes. There's more and more and more of them all the time. But we haven't kept pace ethically, and then with the policy following on, about a question I always ask: why is it important to preserve a species? I've asked lots of people that, and I don't ever really get a satisfactory answer. Like, why is it important that we ensure that the koala doesn't face extinction, but that some unknown macropod from the forests of New Guinea or the inland deserts of Australia is that the same attention and effort is not put into preserving that species? I often say, why is it important to preserve one and not the other? Why does the effort get put into one and not the other? And I rarely get an actual answer. You get deflection. Do you think there's an ethical obligation now that we know enough, or that we should be prepared to actually make the commitment and follow it up with resources?
Well, yes, I guess. I mean, so it's various angles to that question. We can sort of think about. I'm not an ethicist, so I'd struggle to tell my virtue ethics from a deontology and everything else. That sort of as a conservation biologist, we have this sort of values. We have values, right? And we value species individually, and theoretically, we should value all species equally. And there's an ethical mandate there that says that that people shouldn't extinguish species as something we shouldn't be doing, full stop. There are, I guess, utilitarian ways we can defend that. We can say that species X is incredibly important in its environment because it's some keystone, and the loss of that might have ramifications not just for other species but for human well-being, etc. But I think that's a bit of a difficult way to go down that way, because there are probably lots of species out there for which they're pretty functionally redundant, right? I mean, losing them wouldn't result in the collapse of the ecosystem, but as a conservation biologist, we say we want to maintain diversity. So that's an ethical imperative, is not to let extinction happen. Now, there is, I guess, conservation triage as well going on. Now, I think there's obviously massive biases towards the fluffy things. I mean, a good example, in fact, maybe one of the best example of this is sort of in North America, where a vast amount of money was been pumped into saving Californian condors from extinction. Now, Californian condors, other than they are a big spectacular species, a last remnant of the sort of Pleistocene megafauna, and indeed they would have eaten the Pleistocene megafauna. But equally, whilst millions were being invested in conservation of condors, a whole suite of species went extinct in Hawaii. In fact, there was a press release just last week on the loss of these species, but they were all...
Just on that, because I wanted to comment on this in some forum as soon as I had the opportunity. I don't know if you saw the same headline that I did, but scrolling through my feed, the headline was written in a way that you thought it was good news. What was it? 23 species removed from the endangered species list.
Oh, right.
That was the headline, and then you read further down, the United States Wildlife Service has now declared that they're all extinct. So it was like, if you just scrolling through, you would think, oh, that's good news. They're not endangered. They're not on the endangered list anymore.
I sort of wonder if that's on purpose or not. I sort of had my doubts about some press releases that came out of work I was indeed even involved with, the Brazilian government, the Ministério Meio Ambiente. I was sort of nested within the red list process for a long time there, and some of the comms that came out of that were really focused on the stuff that had been changed in status, for instance. So in some cases, it's just because we know the species better, not that somehow anything has changed. For instance, it's gone from vulnerable to least concern or something, or the focus on the species that have gone one way rather than the other way, or the fact that the headlines of all the species we declared extinct were totally buried. But I mean, it's difficult to know then who's in charge of that messaging and why. But sort of returning to the condors, though, there's a really interesting facet there, which is when the condors were all captured in the mid-80s, one of the first things that happened to those condors is they were basically fumigated. Think about animal husbandry. The first thing is, right, how do we improve the welfare of these birds? First thing is get rid of their parasites. And it turned out that 2 of the parasites which occur on condors occurred on nothing else. So in the process of saving condor, like 2 species of condor parasites, like louses, were extinguished, became extinct. They were the last ones on the last condors. But again, we only knew that several years later when those species were officially described, for instance. But that also feeds back into what we do and don't know about biodiversity, but maybe also a bit about what we value. And there's certainly a bias towards mammals and birds rather than other species.
Snails and slugs.
Snails and slugs. We also know a lot less about them. We just got a lot more bird people out there, and people do turn off for these other things. Although maybe that's changing a little bit here with sort of invertebrate conservation, such like. But it needs people to sort of shout about all these other taxa too. And I guess if you were to triage species, then you do it phylogenetically, right? I mean, you could say that some of these Amazonian species are less important because they're sister species and close related. You could say a koala was so phylogenetically distinct that it's worth more, because to evolve the next koala, you're only starting from that position, whereas to evolve the next wood creeper, you'd start from here. So people do triage importance that way. Whether that actually influences decisions made on the ground, I somewhat doubt it. Though hypothetically, you can envisage that happening if we came to that, basically. But normally, conservation is about saving habitat, and when it's single species stuff, which does tend to be mammals and birds, then that's really emergency room things when you have to do captive breeding or whatever else. But I mean, that has been done for insular mollusks and herps and such like, especially with the chytrid crisis, for instance, with herps. So I think, yeah, that bias exists, but maybe we're getting a better handle on it.
Probably gives us a good jumping off point in a minute to I mean, there's so many examples that we could just keep talking about. Like I said earlier, it's probably a whole other episode that maybe we will do one day. But the point really is that preserving species, even those that we don't know are species yet, is wholly dependent on preserving habitat and preserving. I mean, it's even a little bit more complex than just saying habitat. Are we going to preserve forests? No, we actually have to preserve the functioning ecosystem that supports all of the taxa within it. We need to, and I'm talking from a layperson's point of view, because recently I was up in northern and northeast Queensland and Northern Territory, and I was struck as a horticulturist as we were driving through areas where it looked like, there's lots of bush here or scrub. Now, to the untrained eye, it looks like, it's bush, it's good. But it just takes one more step of analysing the visual cues that you're getting. All of the vegetation of the predominant species is the same age, the same height, the same stem thickness, the same age. So it's only regrowth. It's not. It's habitat, but it's not remnant functioning ecosystem that would have preserved the original suite of taxa. It's a totally different thing, but it looks like the bush.
So how good that bush is depends then on its proximity to areas which were never deforested, if you like, then. Because obviously secondary vegetation is important, but its importance is based on its age and its proximity to source populations to colonize it. And, in many parts of the world, you just don't have that. So you end up with secondary habitats full of generalist species of potentially low conservation concern.
Which is why the remnant patches that are in, it's all disjointed, it's fragmented, it's often in very difficult places for people to visit. That's why it's critical that it gets preserved. But
in many cases that it's those areas that became the nature reserves, right? Especially where I am, for instance, it's tiny bits of habitat which, for whatever reason, were not cut down, which were often because they're poor agricultural land or on steep slopes or whatever else, sort of become the nature reserves. And obviously they weren't necessarily the areas which actually had high biodiversity. I mean, if you know England well, the sort of Fenland Basin, which is our sort of agricultural breadbasket here, so the Romans started draining that because they realised that was the best soils, and that area would have been like the Danube Delta in Romania, replete with, it did have Dalmatian pelicans and all these amazing species back in the day, and nowadays it's largely just a field of carrots. Although, the RSPB recently bought a field of carrots, which, like a decade or so later, has common cranes and great bitterns and everything else. So restored wetlands there and brought those species back. So, there's certainly a lesson there, and especially for wetland. But we mentioned this in the State of the Birds report, but in Europe, things doing well tend to be wetland species because we've spent loads of money on making wetlands, and it turns out we've become quite good at that. Wetland species are very good at colonizing wetlands, so we sort of solved that crisis. But the broader crisis is the birds of the wider environment. The bushland birds, for instance, where you are, or farmland birds here, because you can't save them with a small nature reserve. You need changes at the landscape scale, and the landscape's be more permeable, or to use fewer biocides, so there's food, and these are the big challenges. It's very easy to do that small conservation for specialist species which can move around, but it's much more difficult to hold the bioabundance of some more common species when we sort of erode the capacity of ecosystems to support them. And I was involved in another paper led by Rika Bolam at Newcastle, where we sort of did a stock take of how conservation has functioned, and we have stopped lots of extinctions. I think orange-bellied parrot was one of the species that came up in that list of species which would have gone extinct had conservationists not intervened. So we are getting better maybe at stopping things getting onto the red list for some species, but there's still this constant flow of species, and unless we have those wider changes, then it's just going to be more ER, emergency room interventions to try and stop species going extinct. What we want is species not to be endangered in the first instance.
Yeah, and just the simple thing. I mean, in an Australian context, and I'm sure it's common everywhere. It's easier to not remove the habitat, to not bugger up the habitat, than it is to 20 years down the track to try and repair it. It's
absolutely, yeah. We've got a paper which we've been working for a long time based on our Amazonian data, sort of looking at these different opportunity costs associated with preventing deforestation or avoiding degradation or driving, sort of reforestation or essentially creating new forest habitat. And the biggest gains come from, not cutting down the forest in the first instance, or not degrading it by selective logging. And the benefits from creation of new forest, not that we shouldn't be doing that, because we need to do that, but it's paramount we protect the good stuff we already have. And we shouldn't be sort of cutting down forest and then building new, putting up, sort of creating new forest as some sort of counterbalance. But it's almost entirely what this sort of idea of biodiversity net gain is often predicated on here when it comes to in the UK. We're saying, well, we'll get rid of this ancient woodland to build a road through it, but we'll plant and otherwise new woodland. So what you end up with is a load of trees tied to stakes covered in plastic, which are all dead in 2 years' time, and none of that biodiversity associated with the ancient woodland. So a lot of it comes to habitat, and some people just think, well, we could just make more woodland, but I mean, it's irrelevant if that pool of species has disappeared from your landscape, and that's the risk we're sort of running in all sorts of places.
Well, a patch of ground that has a dense cover of trees, like in terms of stems per hectare or stems per acre, is not necessarily a forest.
No.
And we still, after 40 or 50 years, I mean, this goes back to the point of the denialism and the hard denialism.
I was about to exactly say that.
Yeah, there's the hard denialism and there's the soft denialism, and the soft denialism methodology is say, look at all the revegetation we've done. But what they don't say is that they count the monocultures of palms in Southeast Asia. They count that as reforestation. Yeah, the plantations of blue gums in Australia that are destined for the pulp and paper mills is counted as revegetation, and it's not.
Yeah. So that I was going to mention Bjorn Lomborg and other commentators as well have used that figure of global forest cover, where forest includes plantations, and plantations are not forests. Only in the fact they're both groups of trees, if you like.
That's right.
A group of one species of tree. They're cut down after a certain amount of time. There's active measures taken to make sure there aren't any other plants growing there, and they're fundamentally the same ecological value as monoculture of anything else are normally. I mean, our Amazonia work showed us that a teak plantation or eucalyptus plantation or a paricar plantation has the same value in terms of number of species and number of forest-associated species as a field of cows. In fact, often quite a lot less, because the fields of cows and have scrubby corners and edges, etc. So often the same value as a soybean plantation, if you like, sort of the arable crop. So they're not the same. There's some value in the temporary carbon storage, but we shouldn't conflate those two things. But they are routinely conflated by denialists. And again, they know this. They've had this pointed out to them. I mean, people have written whole books pointing out sort of the fallacies in Lomberg's work, but he still keeps trotting out the same stuff. And again, the people that read that sit in their own little social media silos and assume this is conservationists, over-egging a problem. But, we're continuing to lose cover of primary tropical rainforests.
Squirrel. That's kind of what it's like, isn't it? Anyone who wants to follow any of this closely gets lost in the avalanche of information that is provided. And I'm reluctant to call them the gatekeepers in the media, because I think they're more the filterers rather than gatekeepers. I think often they want to disseminate information, but sometimes they don't understand it, and then sometimes it's just too much. And, well, they don't have several hours to tease out the threads. They've got 5 minutes. So it's much easier to go, fluffy animal, zookeeper, pat, isn't that lovely? The kids can come at school holidays and pat the animal or watch the animal. That
connection with nature, that's been quite fundamental. But that's, well, again, we can talk about that a bit more later.
Well, we're going to get there. We're going to get there, I promise. I just realised, Alex, that we've sort of covered off our first two discussions in the one, really, in that we are losing species before we even know that they're a species. Is there anything you wanted to really bring to mind in terms of examples or other issues that we might have missed with the denialism and the new species? I'm just looking at what I highlighted in the papers, and just about everything that I'd marked that I wanted to talk about.
Maybe mention one more example from the Atlantic Forest, which is a different paper. I don't think I shared this one with you, but on the the purple-winged ground dove.
Oh yes, yes.
Which was a species. It was mentioned in one of the papers. We wrote an entire other paper just about that one, and the various stories from this. It was a bird which its conservation status was a bit unknown. There were these reports of people seeing it. Some made them a bit dubious. So maybe the alarm didn't go out early enough about this species. It's interesting because it was a specialist in flowering bamboo. So it was a bird which moved around the landscape and turned up when the bamboo was flowering, produced all these seeds, and then the bamboo would die off, so it would move around. So it's likely that it disappeared because of this lack of connectivity between patches. So, one big patch would all die off, and then it dispersed, but would never find another one, for instance. That was the reason why it probably disappeared, for instance. Is interesting because we maybe missed it, because we thought there were more of them than there were because of what was written in the literature, but then there wasn't often good evidence that the species was there. There was no photos or images or what have you. But the really interesting thing that came from that study is that actually the species was present in captivity. In fact, it was probably present in captivity after it had gone extinct in the wild. But at the time, the Brazilian government basically said to these bird breeders, this species is threatened, it's on a red list, you can't keep it anymore. You can't breed it and you can't move them around. So actually there was an opportunity to save this species through some sort of the guise of some of these people, which were kind of maybe a bit of the bad guys. They'd obviously taken these birds illegally from the wild, which would have been a bit of a drain in the population, but probably wasn't a major, by any means, a driver of why the species was declining. But either way, the government ended up shutting down these breeders, and the species went extinct, when actually it was apparently really easy to breed in captivity. And we might have been able to save it, although again, whether or not the Atlantic Forest as it is now, could even support the species because of this fragmentation is another question. But it was very interesting that the opportunity was there, but it wasn't recognised at the time. This is sort of in the early 90s, basically, and very sad that it was lost. And there's sort of analogies there with the passenger pigeon as well, because people also hypothesise that the passenger pigeon may have also sort of been sort of masting tree species that produce this glut of food, and a species which moved around at very large spatial scales. And in the case of passenger pigeon, maybe only bred when there were hundreds of thousands of birds present. It was like a queue for this thing to breed, and it collapsed very, very quickly in relatively few generations. There was also massive market hunting with that species as well, and the extinction of the American chestnut. But it seemed like there was an alley effect going on with the passenger pigeon, where they needed this group size thing, and maybe there was something similar going on with the ground dove. But the real story for me is that the opportunity was there and it was missed, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen again. And maybe that means sort of casting a blind eye to some historical sort of illegal acts, if you like, with trafficking these species. But once you've got there and you've got that knowledge, then we can't make that mistake again. And there's always persistent rumours of some species in trade, and I've done a bit of work in Southeast Asia. I was a supervising thesis along with Stuart Marston, who's based here, of a former PhD student, Harry Marshall, and he worked on the Asian sort of songbird crisis, and sort of increasingly not seeing necessarily these protagonists involved with keeping as being the bad guys, but working out how we change the nature of that trade, how we might breed birds in captivity, etc. How we work with these people to work out the crisis rather than sort of just demonizing them. And again, there's a connection with nature angle we come back to there, why people keep these birds in the first place.
Well, there's two great examples in Southeast Asia. One that I've done a show on, and one that I haven't, but that I know about because I've visited the captive breeding program of the Bali starling. But the conversion of hunters and traffickers for the pet trade with the Philippines cockatoo. They've turned the people who actually have been studying them informally, so that they know when to go and collect eggs, or when to go and get chicks, and where they're going to breed. Those people have been turned into rangers through an NGO. There are examples like that all over the world, and the ground dove that you mentioned, we sometimes don't give the aviculture community any credit as being experts. These people know how to breed them in captivity. They know how to maintain a captive population, and sometimes we should maybe be more welcoming of them. And just an aside, I mean, we've probably got more hooded and golden-shouldered parrots in Germany and the UK than exists naturally in Australia in the wild. They've been successfully bred for probably 100 years now. So
again, it's something we called for in the state of the world's birds report. For me, it's always a last ditch thing, ex situ work, but it is something we need. And there's a lot of species which we've zero idea how to keep alive in captivity. You've got, saying zero idea now, but this is now happening in Southeast Brazil, and people starting to work, for instance, on how do you breed ant birds in captivity. There's never been a demand for that, and therefore there's no knowledge of that. But we're likely to be at the point that if we don't know how to do that, we will lose these species, because they're not persisting in these tiny forest fragments. So, and there's a stopgap until we can reconnect these places. Then you're gonna have to have an arc population, basically.
And the last thing on losing the species before we discover them, really, I was struck by the numbers, the scale of the citizen science undertaking in Brazil that you had mentioned in that paper. That was for the kinglet Calyptra. Is that the right pronunciation?
That's the one.
And and also the Glaucus macaw purple-winged ground dove. there were 20,112 participating bird photographers trying to collect images of either of any of those species.
Yeah. So that I can say it's a really interesting talking point, because it's how do we create a community of birders? So when I first went to Brazil as a volunteer guide, the clientele, the lodge where I worked, everyone was from the global north. You know, they were all, most people from North America, some people from Europe. You know, needed a guide to go birding. If you went back there now, actually, most people are actually Brazilians that are visiting that lodge now to look for birds. Now, what changed was this website called WikiAvis, I think, is really the fundamental driver of creating a community of Brazilian birders. Now, when I first went to Brazil, there was no field guide. Probably really still isn't a really good field guide to Brazil. You know, I had photos of specimens. I had the birds of Venezuela. I'd printed out some plates from Handbook of the Birds of the World. You know, there was no eBird, there was no Xenocanto, there was none of that. I had some old recordings from a couple of CDs. You know, we used to trade in tapes between the bird guys there. I had some cuts of bird recordings that no one else had, so I'd be like, swap this for 10 of these. And you know, the landscape was very different then of how to do birding. It was very difficult to do birding. And along came this guy, Reinaldo Guedes, a Brazilian who quite interested in birds, computer programmer. He created a website where people could upload their bird pictures and other people would identify them. And it became like a wiki site where people populated that information about the bird, etc. But like overnight, it created this community of Brazilian birders where there hadn't been previously an NGO for amateurs. You know, there was a very active ornithological community there of scientists, but there was no like amateur community. And that grew and grew and grew. And then very quickly, there were more bird images on WikiAvis and there were specimens in all the museums in Brazil, and really changed our understanding of where birds were in space and time, and create sort of a nation of bird photographers, and maybe it's sort of less a nation of e-birders, although that's catching up there too. But yeah, amazing discoveries precipitated by this, and sort of emerging middle class there interested in birds and bird watching, and propping up a domestic ecotourism economy of guides, etc., and generating huge amounts of information, which in the case of Calyptura is negative information, right? People know the bird's there. There's people photographing vagrant North American wood warblers in the canopy of these forests in Rio de Janeiro. I mean, for me, there's very little chance that the Calyptura persists, basically, because there's all these people there. The same for the ground dove. There's just not saturation coverage, but the bird just would have been seen by then. And it's some of these people that also photographed, you know, things which were new, and examples from that from Peru recently, I think, with a wood quail, which may or may not have been photographed first by sort of professional ornithologists, but certainly there were images pasted of an undescribed taxon on eBird, for instance. So having this community out there gives us this big data, both in terms of rich media, images and sounds, but also in sightings, that we, you know, fundamentally changes our ability to do ornithology. So that's, you know, incredibly exciting.
Yeah, a bit of a plug here. That's one of the reasons why I'm so keen on sort of pushing my first seen and heard birds in the morning, and promoting the swift brick lady in Britain, Hannah, with her My First Bird, because it just helps people who are not into birds connect with what's locally, and then some of those people will get the bug and may then go out and become observers or using iNaturalist in their local area, and they might discover an undescribed parrotfinch, as someone I met recently in Darwin did, because he was trying out his camera photographing butterflies in East Timor, and just happened to snap a bird, put it up, ask someone, "What's this?" Oh, undescribed species of parrotfinch. So these things happen all over the world.
Absolutely,
and it's just being out there and looking.
I think that sort of a bit. Well, Merlin is a good example as well. I've seen so many people here that have downloaded Merlin. That's been a game changer for people who have no idea, and that suddenly just opens up the world. And just like it has for me, for iNaturalist, again, I mean, you know, I didn't need Merlin to get into birds, because into long before that. But I needed INAP to get into photographing slime molds and slugs and everything else. So because I wouldn't have gone out and bought a field guide on them otherwise, because it's too hard. So having that community behind me has got me interested in those things. And actually, when I was at the bird fair over the summer, because of this British Birdwatching Fair, where incidentally I had a pint with Hanno, you just mentioning, a chat there. But anyway, I ended up leaving the bird fair with a book on hoverflies and a book on well, in fact, a book on liverworts of all things, and and stuff which I couldn't even imagine myself 5 years ago being interested in, but now I am. So it's amazing what some of these tools can get you in as being a sort of a gateway drug to buying field guides on lower plants.
Well, I'm going to follow up on the gateway concept in a moment, but I think that's a really good jumping off point for us to get into this document. Don't you love green screen? There we go. It works this time. The Alex Lee's version of the State of the World's Birds report. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 authors, of which in this publication you're the lead author. So let's talk about the state of the world's birds from your point of view. One, why is a report like this necessary?
So I guess it's a review. So as a scientific document, it's supposed to summarize what we know, and that's for all sorts of audiences. It's for lay audiences to get an understanding of the state of nature. It's for politicians to understand the state of nature. But it's also a jumping off point for the scientists to take stock of what we should be doing, and what the priorities are, what we know and what we need to know. So I was sort of asked by the editorial board of annual reviews, could I lead this and therefore put together a team of people who had experience in working on similar documents in other parts of the world, the state of India's birds as well, they're represented there, to try and take stock of what we know. And probably someone will write a similar one of these in 20 or 30 years' time. But there's been sort of in the annual review series, there have been ones done for mammals and for invertebrates and such like. The invertebrates ones, like the state is we don't know enough about invertebrates. The birds one is actually we know loads and loads about birds. And the answer is a lot of them aren't doing very well, and there are a lot more declining than there are increasing, for instance. That's the big take, I guess, which probably comes as a surprise to no one. But then there's lots of nuances there as to what the most important drivers are, for instance, and what we do and don't know, and the impact of changing taxonomy we've been talking about on number of threatened species, etc., etc.
Now, right through the report, you're talking about different geological time periods. So you've got the Holocene and the Anthropocene, which abut each other. So extinction is a natural function over time. But how much faster is the rate of extinction now, and how much of it is natural, and have you been able to quantify how much of it is driven by the activities of man?
So let me start with your first point, which is naturalness of extinction. So conservation biology is this sort of holistic crisis discipline, if you like, and we have all these fundamental tenets, right? And one of these is that extinction is bad when it's driven by people. Extinction is a natural process. Then we have extinctions of lineages, or you have one species becoming extinct in a way because it's evolved into a different species or whatever, and that's a natural process. And the aim of conservation biology, I guess, in a way, isn't to eliminate extinction, but to stop the rate of extinction overwhelming the rate of speciation. And that's where we are now, because we have massively elevated extinction rates because of the impacts of people on the biosphere, and that's many orders of magnitude greater than the natural extinction rates, which are quite difficult to get at because they involve looking at the fossil record, basically, which is obviously also massively incomplete. But we're talking several orders of magnitude higher rate of extinction at the moment, and some people are comparing this current extinction rate and asking whether or not that may be coming up to some of those sorts of mass extinction rates we've seen in the past. And difficult to measure that now because we're sort of in the middle of it, or maybe we're just at the start of it, even depending on the impacts of climate change. But we're certainly elevated over anything we've seen, in sort of recent epochs, basically, and that's driven by humans' changes in the biosphere, and that goes back a long way. That goes back maybe the start of that. There's some evidence that hominids may have been changing abundance, precipitating extinctions 2 million years ago almost. That's certainly very good evidence now that major changes in Australia from use of fire precipitated extinction of megafauna 40,000 years ago. And then there's an ongoing argument amongst the sort of Holocene ecologists of the role of people in this, and what was the role of climate versus the role of humans in the extinction of the megafauna. Even then, they're massively entwined. When it comes to use of fire, modification of landscapes, what sort of precipitated climate change. And yes, there's climate change happening, but with fewer amounts of less habitat left, you're more likely to get extinctions, etc. So yes, it's a crisis because extinction rates are elevated. And yes, we're driving that crisis, but no, extinction is also a natural process. And I guess there was an interesting example a few years ago of the extirpation of, I think it was endemic species of rock wren, I think, on an island off Mexico, which was extirpated probably by the eruption of a volcano there. And that was a minimally distinctive taxon, but species colonize islands and go extinct on islands, and they're vulnerable to extinction. And islands themselves are incredibly important for biodiversity, and they have, I think it's like 20% of species globally, I think, occur on islands. I think that's a fact in our paper we look at, and that's where most of extinctions have happened because they're more vulnerable than mainland systems. But again, it's also something we raised that's where extinctions are currently happening is on mainland, and we've sort of got through this sort of era of island extinctions, and now we're sort of starting on the continents, which is itself incredibly worrying.
Although it's probably safe to say that there still probably will be island extinctions. There just won't be extinctions at the rate that there had been in like the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. It's
in most places at least we sort of realise the error of our ways, and it's either stuff has gone extinct that's going to go extinct. In many cases, we eliminated the things that are most vulnerable in many areas, or we're starting to do conservation in these areas as well. And it's obviously islands it's easier to save stuff when it's a relatively small area and small interventions and such like. So I'd hope we're not committed to 2 more of those. But then, as you mentioned right at the start, there's exploration in islands off Papua New Guinea, and there's timber extraction, and there's ongoing change we don't have a good handle on, and then there's Asian songbird crisis and birds being removed from islands and trade and other problems. So that's not to say there's not going to be more extinctions there, but I think the shift is definitely towards continental systems where we've got massive fragmentation, which almost mimics the sort of island processes in small patches.
And we haven't even talked about artificial light, the increasing amount of artificial light in settlements on islands and being used on vessels around islands, and then the erections of panes of glass and other reflective surfaces on islands. All these things could have impacts on, even though the individual occurrences might be very small in number, if there's very few of those birds left, every one of those occurrences becomes more problematic in terms of the survival of the species. So there's so many threats. But why are birds important in the context of the global biota?
So this is a functional question then, rather than because it's. I mean, there's the importance in terms of what we talked about earlier on in the ethics. So yeah, so birds are important for all sorts of different ecosystem processes, being their prey or predators or seed dispersers or pollinators or scavengers. So there's sort of a rich academic literature that shows the importance of birds, to drive ecosystem processes. Though again, I doubt they're as important as most insects are in driving. It's often the little things that really drive the planetary processes. And there are, I guess, a good example might be Guam, for instance, to encapsulate some of those things we've been talking about, and the introduction of this brown tree snake, Boiga irregularis, on Guam, precipitated this extinction cascade of basically all the forest-associated birds. And there was a paper that came out a few years ago showing that Guam is sort of shifted to this sort of spider-dominated ecosystem, where it's sort of a nightmarish, for an arachnophobe forests which are just covered in spiders because there's no bird predation, and then the community of insects is fundamentally shifted in plants because of this absence of this impact of top-down predation by birds. So you can see what the absence of birds looks like in those forests, and it's a fundamentally altered ecosystem. It's still an ecosystem with ecosystem processes, but very different from that original ecosystem, and it sort of remains to be seen what the long-term consequences might be for standing carbon stock and any of these things, because we're too early in that experiment to know what's going to happen, basically. I guess another good example people often mention is, diclofenac and vultures and India, and the upshot of losing millions of vultures has been the end of those vulture carcass removal services, and that translated into a population explosion of feral dogs and an outbreak of rabies. So there's very obvious connections which biodiversity loss translates into loss of ecosystem services, translates into costs for humans, basically.
Yeah, and I mean the difficult thing about discussing work like this report, Alex, is that the problems are just so huge, and that because birds are always around, you look out the window and you see birds, but you don't really notice the decline. So let's skip ahead to comparing what we knew about populations of birds, and we can perhaps try and tackle it in a global sense and then maybe some localised examples. But comparing the 20th century to where we are in the 21st century.
Well, permit me to just take one step backwards before I go one step forwards.
Sure.
You say it's very hard, but in the case of vultures in India, it's just a case of banning one veterinary drug. And that's a classic case of a solution which is actually quite easy. I mean, vultures face all sorts of other problems elsewhere, but sometimes there are silver bullets and things that are quite simple. And when we find them, we should definitely do that. Except we haven't done that because people are still selling that drug in Europe and in Africa now. So we've literally knew what the problem is, really obvious, and then we persisted because of our capitalist model, and people have managed to deny the problem or obfuscate it, and we've ended up there. So I mean, that's the really infuriating part, because so often you have these interlinked problems and social and ecological dimensions, but that one's such an obvious one that we should have fixed and seem to have failed to do so.
Well, there's a allied issue here with rodenticides, with first generation and second generation. One persists in the food chain and kills lots of raptors and other scavengers and whatnot. There's a solution there. Stop selling one. You can still control the rodents with the other one. We've been talking about it on this show for 3 years. And,
well, I'd love to talk about that in a bit when we talk about bird feeding, because there's a massive connection there. So, so what you wanted to ask me about was changes in bird bioabundance, and well, in North America and Europe, then, because of citizen scientists, and indeed long before they were called citizen scientists, we've been surveying the birds, and we've been able to measure these changes. you can then look further back, looking at old texts that give you an idea of bird bioabundance, or we can look back further still and look at old maps of where habitats were, and by inference, maybe sometimes even, several hundred years ago, we get an understanding of what species were there. Maybe not how many of them there were, but we have an understanding of that change. You go back further, then the paleological record, the pollen cores can tell you about what habitats were like, or the fossil record. So there's various bits of evidence, and they get more robust the closer we go forward. So in the global north, we've got good data showing major changes in many species, most of which, well, the majority of which are going down. Quite a lot are stable, and then fewer species going up. Some of those because of targeted conservation interventions, some of those simply because they do better in human modified landscapes. Great for them, but they're in the minority. When it comes to the tropics, places like the State of India Bird Report, the massive uptake of eBird use there means that over a decadal scale, we've got really good data on changes there. We can infer changes in the tropics in many places because of old records or point-based surveys, and then modelling those up and knowing history of habitat loss to sort of get at what we think are the magnitude of changes recently that have happened. And a student, a former sort of postdoc who was working with me, Jack Shutt, we'll talk about him later on because he was leading some of this feeder work. I mean, he's been working with me to measure likely changes in Amazonian bird population sizes, or at least occupancy, based on satellite time series. And again, most species going down, some species very few stable, and then some species going up, in some cases massively so, because they're birds which like living in a field of cows. And then I always come back to that story because you can think about something like yellowish pipit, which has massively increased in Amazonia because we've changed forest into pasture. The species can use those habitats, and I think back to, well, what do we value in the UK, for instance? And we're sort of crying our eyes out over loss of skylarks, which are a brilliant bird, and they've declined massively because we've made our agricultural landscapes more and more impermeable to them. There's, they're getting run over by, the machines. We've switched from hay meadows to silage, so they're getting the nest destroyed. Biocide usage means that there's not the abundance of plants and insects in those fields. But taking a step backwards, I mean, skylarks became massively abundant because we converted lots of formerly not skylark suitable habitat into skylark suitable habitat, and then we've gone and made this skylark habitat not very good for skylarks. So, I mean, skylarks are probably more common 100 years ago than they've ever been in the UK, but because we'd created loads of habitat which is formerly suitable for lots of other species, some of which we've completely gone extinct. So it's always a baseline of where we measure things to, and a question of what our conservation priorities are, even in some cases. And not to say that I don't think we should conserve farmland birds here, but that's maybe we should also be thinking about the things we've completely lost in the UK 2,000 years ago as the stuff we should also be worried about. But so often conservation is like whoever's leading it now, it's their baseline is the biodiversity that was around in their youth. And many people have watched, and I've indeed watched it here in the UK, the farmland bird species disappear, things like turtle doves, or the bioabundance of common swifts disappear, for instance. But there's swifts and house martins, again, of probably some of those species maybe 100 years ago were a lot commoner than they were historically because we created loads of habitat for them and lots of opportunities for them to nest. So this question of baselines is quite a tough one. And, I'm not sure we always get it right, or at least what our priorities should be.
We've got a reservoir of skylark genetics here, thanks to the Colonial Project.
Still buntings in New Zealand as well. We've even we lost a species of bumblebee from the UK, and we ended up importing it back from New Zealand because it had been introduced there, for instance. And there's even a cool paper showing recently that some of the bird songs in New Zealand, there's some of these, and perhaps Australia as well, of some of these introduced European bird species are like the songs that they used to sing in Britain 100 years ago that have now been lost because of sort of cultural drift and evolution as well. But again, not really a rationale to be introducing stuff we don't lose it elsewhere. Although serendipitously, in the case of the bumblebee, maybe that wasn't, some good came of that bad, basically.
I was actually thinking about this yesterday on my dog walk with Shadow, because I generally about 5 a.m. Take him out, and it's just the very beginning of the the dawn twilight, and the blackbirds are singing madly, and they are so numerous around me. I mean, this suburban landscape where I live is just perfect for them. And I started wondering whether if we captured 3, 4, 5,000 blackbirds here and took it back to a rewilded part of Britain, would they actually speciate because they could no longer talk to the resident blackbirds? I mean, do you think that? I mean, I know we're getting off the point a little bit, but do you think that's sort of likely that it's only a small time period, but it's enough for that memory of the species of those bird songs, which are important for them to make connections and to breed outside the group?
Yeah, it's difficult to know. You might get female preference for either the Antipodean song type, or there might be female preference for the Northern Hemisphere song type. So it's difficult to know which way that would go, or whether they would mate assortatively, or whether the newcomers would struggle in that environment. I certainly wouldn't. I don't think we need to put them back in. And it's often the case of conservation translocations. Moving people happens here all the time. Like a development will happen, people will go and collect all the common lizards and they'll move them somewhere else. But normally that's just a waste of money because you just dump them to a habitat that's already got them, which are at carrying capacity. And the best thing to do would be not to cost them the habitat in the first instance. So I don't know. I'd be surprised if there was a difference, though. It might be interesting. I mean, I wouldn't advocate actually doing that, but under laboratory conditions, you could do playback experiments with, playing the song of northern blackbirds to southern populations and vice versa, and see what happens. It might be an interesting thing. But we know we get rapid sort of cultural drift in bird song types, and we sort of talk about taxonomy earlier on. Well, the only currently recognised species level endemic in the UK is Scottish crossbill, but the only diagnostic field mark we have from them is the voice, and that species, if we want to call it that, no longer makes that noise anymore. So there's now no diagnostic thing to tell a Scottish crossbill, although there's now another call type has evolved there, and it just shows you this plasticity, if you like, this how variable and over time and space the calls of a lot of these ocine passerines are, which is completely different to what we talked about earlier on with the Amazonian birds, because these are sub-ocene passerines which have these innate vocalizations. So a difference from one region to another is coded into the bird's genome rather than something which is evolved in the field through hearing conspecifics, members of their own species. So again, a nice linkage back to where we were earlier on.
And exactly what I feared was going to happen, Alex, has happened. That we can easily discuss all of these things for hours. Let's. Where would you like to go next when we're talking about the state of the world's birds? I mean, world's birds. The next sort of heading in the report was the spatio-temporal variation in extinction risk to birds, and then patterns and trends in avian extinctions. Perhaps we can just talk about the two of those together.
Yeah, so it seemed pretty obvious that there were going to be more threatened birds in the tropics. And I actually asked the question while we were writing the paper about, well, are there actually proportionally more? And we thought this must be obvious that was the case, but actually it turned out when we crunched the numbers that actually there was like proportionally more temperate zone species threatened, and none of us expected that, and no one had ever actually asked that question of the data before, because obviously there are a lot fewer birds at temperate latitudes than there are in the tropics, but it turns out that actually there's not any difference in the number of species that are threatened. In fact, there actually seems to be more threatened species at temperate latitudes. So that was something of a discovery, that what we weren't expecting to find there. There was this sort of expectation that tropical birds are more proportionally threatened. That isn't the case. It is the case there are a lot more of them that are threatened, And in many cases, we're a lot more worried about them because they often have very, very, very small global range sizes, and therefore the risk of extinction is often higher. But then, you've got species like European turtle dove, which has a vast global range size, millions of individuals, but, not unlike the sort of passenger pigeon story, and not unlike the purple winged ground dove story in a way, abundant species which are declining rapidly. And, if those numbers play out and they continue to decline, then they could disappear.
With the temperate species, were there particular groups of birds that are facing the rapid decline more than others? Like I immediately think perhaps seabirds in the temperate zone.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are declines from species from across the avian tree of life, but yeah, seabirds are one group that are doing particularly badly, and it speaks to the variation, right? I mean, there were and still are lots of threatened water birds, but we're getting better at reversing those declines at temperate latitudes in a way we're not sort of doing in the global south at the moment, for instance. So there's sort of ups and downs and across different taxa and for different reasons. So it's almost sort of a bit hard to generalize across the avian tree of life, because you are seeing erosion of branches from right across, although it really depends on things like range size and specialization, which are some of the key things. I mean, if you can get generalists throughout the tree of life, and sometimes, the generalists sort of occupy, or sometimes even get sort of specialists which occupy a niche space, which if they're all right, if they don't have competitors, they can do all right. And often extinction can happen at branches of the tree of life which are quite dense, because if you change the environmental conditions, then you can no longer have 3 similar species anymore. And that's what we see, for instance, in the Amazon. It's from our own data showing that like competition between species can mediate those extinction dynamics. And when you change a habitat, you erode parts of a species niche that it can no longer persist in alongside another species, for instance. Whereas something that's a bit out there, something that's a bit weird in the avian tree of life, it can still maintain doing that one weird thing it does. Or sometimes it doesn't, because it's some change has happened, which means it can no longer hold out there. So it's quite variable, really, looking across species. Though, as you mentioned, there are seabirds doing badly globally because of this whole raft of problems, including shifts in climate, changes in predation rates because of introduced species, bycatch, etc., etc.
There's just so many challenges, aren't there, for but
then easy fixes for some of those things, right? Bycatch, yeah. We've got fixes for that. We're quite good now at removing introduced predators from islands, so we're getting good at that too. Climate is the biggie, right? I mean, that requires action at a global scale, and that threatens so many species, and that probably does disproportionately threaten tropical birds, because you get this phenomenon called the escalator to extinction, which happens on tropical mountain ranges. You've got very, very restricted distributions. Species might only occur between 300 and 400 meters altitude, and there's a different species occurs below that, and maybe a different species occurs above that, all in the same genus, and they replace each other elevationally. As the climate warms, the species ranges must shift upslope, and then it's almost like the 10 in the bed and the little one said, the one at the edge, its whole niche disappears because it's the one below it goes up, competes with it, and wipes it out. So we're seeing evidence for that from studies in Papua New Guinea, from the Andes, etc., showing this sort of escalator to extinction. A friend of mine, sort of Ben Freeman, has driven a lot of that work, and sort of very, very scary prognosis for especially for tropical montane birds, but also in Amazonia, where you're sort of at the thermal limits for many species, and there's models showing wet bulb temperatures in the Western Amazon exceeding these thresholds, and that will mean that that life will be impossible for many species there too. So there's real worry there, and it's not facilitated by competition in that case. It's just facilitated by the upper thermal limits that birds are capable of living under.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the wet bulb. It's not only important for the Australian Open and Wimbledon. It's got some real uses. Can we perhaps look at what the major threats are that are driving the biodiversity loss? I mean, we've talked about some of them in passing, but can we have a look at each one in depth? And I'm particularly interested in hunting and trapping and invasive species and the flow on which may be disease. So, I mean, I might start. Land cover and land use change is the one that we're always talking about.
Yeah. So they are the biggies, and this perennial question of what is land for. So that's the primary threats for more species, perhaps. But some of these additional threats, like you mentioned, trade, are important for many species, and in some cases they are the most important threat. In fact, we talk about things like barley starlings or black-winged starlings. I mean, these birds would not be threatened if it wasn't for trade. I mean, they'd probably be all right and live in human-modified landscapes in Java and Bali and such like. So, and again, hopefully there are fixes for these sort of things. Disease is certainly an issue for some taxa. Again, something we can cross later on. It's an emerging this sort of global HPAI epidemic, highly pathogenic avian influenza, is almost emerged after we've written this paper, and we've seen declines in populations of great skewers. There's Catharactus the northern hemisphere Catharacta skewer that like 70% perhaps in some colonies, and maybe upwards of that sort of number across the entire range of the species. So potentially birds heading sort of rapidly into the global red list, which have been up to this point increasing. So there is real worries there, and we keep seeing sort of new diseases emerging. Again, something we can talk about later on when it comes to bird feeding, for instance, but something we certainly need to keep a watchful eye on, and trade. Again, new foci of trade emerging. I mean, in Brazil where I work, trade's sort of less of an issue, but for a few species it is a big issue. Things like the large-billed sea finch, which is this species used in singing competitions, would otherwise be a bird which would proliferate in some sort of degraded Amazonian landscapes. It ought to do fine there, but it's just been trapped out because it has such high value. And red siskins on the Guyana Shield are another example, for instance, as well. So there are examples from across the world of trade, and especially the case then in Southeast Asia. And again, there are solutions. So it is an existential threat, but it's one with a relatively easy to fix, rather than land use change and climate change are much more difficult, really, and need sort of state level solutions, really, and global agreements about how we fix these problems.
Well, we'll sort of conclude this portion of the discussion with climate change, but you'd mentioned habitat fragmentation and degradation, and it's something we discuss often in different contexts on this show. But is it too late in most cases, do you think, to stop the fragmentation? And I mean, I like to separate them out a little bit, because if you stop the fragmentation and you haven't done the degradation, you have really critical, important habitat.
Yep.
But if the fragmentation continues and different taxa are not in the isolated, fragmented, valuable habitat, then the worth of that parcel of land diminishes rather than increases, or maybe diminishes, depending on what is in that reservoir.
Yeah. So maybe I can use sort of Amazonia again as a sort of useful context to discuss that. So just to make sure that listeners are on the same page as us, then by deforestation, for instance, we would mean the complete removal of any forest habitat, or it could be, it could be grassland changed to a field of wheat or whatever it is. So the complete removal of habitat, whereas degradation is a reduction in quality of that habitat. So in Amazonian context, that the reduction in quality comes from selective logging, so removal of commercially valuable tree species and the sort of trashing of the habitat, but in that process as well, or it means through wildfires, which are not normally something that landowners want to happen, because they'll then remove, they'll then destroy commercially valuable tree species unless wildfire is a tool, to drive deforestation. So in the context of that Amazonian crisis, there was lots of confusion there, but actually most of the fires there weren't running through standing forests. They were fires which were affecting forests which had been felled, and the fire was just a tool to clear areas, basically, which had already been felled, for instance, although some of those fires then escaped into neighbouring forests and caused the degradation, which means that some bird species and lots of other species wouldn't then persist in those habitats. So with Amazonia as an example of that, so Brazil has visionary environmental legislation, this Código Florestal, the forestry code, where they stipulate like a set amount of land which has to be maintained as primary habitats, which varies between Brazilian biomes, but in the Amazon that's supposed to be like 80%. 80% of your property must remain as forest, and in some consolidated deforestation areas that's 50%. The forestry code also mandates that habitat alongside perennial streams must be protected. So you'd have these corridors supposedly linking the landscape together. There's laws that says you can't deforest on slopes and in the sources of streams. So amazing legislation, of which we have none of that in the UK. People can do what they like on their land. We're creating legislation that should pay people to do these things, but in Brazil it's legally mandated that happens. And then obviously there's very variable rates of compliance, but if we had full compliance with that, and that only comes then with, at first, having rural properties registered. So actually lots of NGOs in the last couple of decades in the Amazon have worked on making sure that people have land tenure, because without land tenure you have this problem that you can't be held account for what you've done to that land, but you're also vulnerable to then having your neighbour come and shoot you in a land dispute. And I've literally, when I was doing my PhD, I saw the body of a local bank manager been shot on the shot dead on the forecourt of a petrol station by the owner of the petrol station over a land dispute. So NGOs in the Amazon have sort of come in and started helping with this process the state should have been driving, to make sure everyone had land tenure. If everyone has that tenure, they can be held account for what they should be doing under the forestry code. And again, I've sort of spent a lot of time criticising Brazil, but Britain's terrible. We have none of this legislation to make sure that people...
Here.
And there'd be massive pushback if you even said to someone, no, you've got to reforest X% of your land. People are more likely potentially then to go and, do these things if they're paid to do it. And that's what we're working towards. But we do have ways and means to do this. And as you said, it is critical to make sure we can rescue populations within these areas. And they're often co-benefits. So we know, that, the number of birds perform ecosystem services in coffee plantations and in other crops, and then predating on these pathogens. Evidence in the UK, people having these beetle banks, which are great for sources of food for things like grey partridges, but these predatory beetles then are getting insect pests within the crop. So if we're working with nature and then against it, there's often win-win situations to be had there, and I think that's where we've got to be to make agriculture more sustainable. I mean, you can go down the land sparing, land sharing route as well, and we could talk all day about that. But then there's big questions there about, is it sustainable intensification? Is that really a thing? But ultimately, I think, in the Brazilian context, we certainly want to be sparing land because you're never going to have all this amazing forest biodiversity in these human modified landscapes, but there is value in having biodiversity within those landscapes of some form or other to maintain ecosystem services which are crucial to the long-term resilience of those landscapes.
Do you have the oft trotted out slogan in the UK that the farmers are the custodians of nature? They're the stewards of
that comes up a lot for farmers and gamekeepers and landowners, and yeah, I sort of tend to disagree, although they are in the sense that the people that do own the land and the people that have the responsibility to do something. It's very easy, I guess, to sort of point the fingers at farmers and say, well, you guys, you created this mess here. But I think you also have to look back and say, well, why did they create this mess? And they created it because government policy said they create that. In the post-war years, we did everything to make sure we could increase production at home. And that came at a huge cost for biodiversity. We asked farmers to do these things. We paid them to do these things. There were massive grants to get rid of hedgerows and to fill in ponds and do all these things. So it was the farmers' fault. They did those things, but it's also because we asked them to do those things. And now we want to ask them to put the ponds back and to put the hedgerows back, because otherwise, as Farmers Weekly here said a few years ago, there's only 100 harvests left. And we had massive rains recently in the UK. There's this massive storm system, which huge flooding. I mean, my timeline on Twitter basically for the last month seemingly has just been cars going down streets in various different parts of the world, except recently it was cars going down streets in like 60 miles south of here in the other side of the Peak District in my home county. So sort of people that said that you sort of experience climate change is becoming steadily closer to where you are, and I certainly got the feeling there. So
but our memories are very short, because that happened about, 10 or 12 years ago in parts of Britain that I can remember the timeline and the morning news shows showing people who had gone up to their top floor and were waving out to people to get them food, or they were sitting on their roofs.
Yeah,
it's not an
isolated
areas, event.
Well, no, but a lot of these areas have been in the west, which is where we normally get weather systems from. So we got this system which basically came in from the east, and therefore the east got way more rain than there were just records being broken all over the shop, and the infrastructure wasn't there as well. People had no expectation of flooding there, so that really caught people off guard. Where it's like the west is like expected to flood, and their cars they're fine, and we expect them to drift down the river or whatever, So we had this major flooding event, but what we've seen, and the biggie is like the topsoil is just disappearing, and like if we're not, it's the most important thing, isn't it? Like the soil, we're like fundamentally you can't feed 8.5 billion people, or however many people are going to have, unless we look after the soils. But we're undermining legislation at home here to protecting soils, and we don't hold farmers to account. And you encourage worse practices, and it all comes back to the consumer as well, right? My old grandfather, I think mentioned earlier on, I spent my youth spent on a little dairy farm in Essex, where there were like grandfather had like 26 cows, and they all had names. They'd come when he called the individual names, and his farm had all this suite of species which had been lost. And not economical farming the way he did, or not anymore. And supermarkets won't buy milk from someone like that, because it's inefficient, and they want to buy from one producer and it encourages this race to the bottom. And even then, if he was still around now, he wouldn't have access to all the funding to put the ponds back in and do all these things. He never got rid of them. So we're not rewarding the people that behave well either in all this, and we're not selling a product which has environmental value tied into it. We've driven the prices of food down in this country here, so people pay less and less of their wage in food. At the same time, this intertwined problem of house prices and rents have just gone up and up and up. So people's entire budget goes on, some shitty little hovel in London, which is 10 times the cost of my mortgage for a 2-bedroom house here, for instance. So that's the problem, because we've sort of created this space for cheap food at massive environmental cost, and then other stuff is gone on and up and up. So we've got more and more poverty, even though the price of food's come down, and we're producing food often in a way that isn't sustainable. And also then globally we're eating stuff that probably isn't sustainable either, coming back to the issues with cheap beef and such like.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone down a rabbit hole, which is so easy to do, but I wanted to maybe broaden out that historical context. Like you were talking about farming post-war or post-industrial revolution, but if you go a couple of hundred years further back, a lot of the farming practices were driven by the squire or the king. People had to produce to satisfy taxation demands or other demands. So every step along the way, when it's come to exploiting the land, we've always done it in new and just increasingly damaging ways. I think for the natural environment. And
so we've sort of seen this globalization of agriculture as well, right? I mean that manifests itself both in like the abandonment of land in Eastern Europe and the return of wolves, etc. But even in the UK, for instance, where 60 years ago the average farm would have done different things, they would have had some animals there, they might have had multiple crops. Like globalization has meant that it's specialization. So where I am, it's just all sheep. You go to East Anglia, it's mostly fields of wheat or whatever. And so lots of farming birds have disappeared because the landscape has become homogenized. You know,
or if they persist, they're fragmented populations. So
well, I mean, just just disappeared from the whole landscape here. Like things like yellowhammers, you know, the sort of granivorous birds don't live here anymore because there's no broken ground anymore. And you could say, well, maybe it makes sense to only do sheep here, but I mean, the reason why yellowhammer has disappeared is because with that farming environment, it's become homogenized. And you know, 100 years ago, they're producing oats and eating oats, and maybe we could even go back to that. You could still probably grow it here, and it probably produce more better protein yield than producing sheep would. Or we could, probably better off with fewer cows here and people only occasionally eating beef rather than producing a vast amount of cheap mutton and lamb, which comes at a very high environmental cost because sheep are very fussy grazers and they just eat the good stuff, and you just end up with a sward of Molinia caerulea and a purple moorgrass like we do here. So again, there's some joined up stuff we can sort of think about doing, but it does mean that we want to, if we're going to do agricultural subsidies, we want to target them at biodiversity and ecosystem services whilst making sure it's in a socially just way, and we don't just end up with farmers abandoning the land, which is also a risk. And there's plenty of sort of right-wing hawks, and some of them sort of right-wing ecologically orientated ones that sort of want to see that happening. I think that would also be the travesty, just sort of massive urban to rural migration, the collapse of these areas, and we're getting sort of infilling with carbon markets emerging as well, and there's lots of scams there as well. That we're not going to come out of this biodiversity and climate crisis just by doing some offsetting and having that as business as usual either, which seems to be what we're charging after here, and especially not when that offsetting involves planting a load of trees which then burn down 5 years later in a wildfire driven by climate change, driven by business as usual. So I think we have to be much more clever, and I think than we are doing at the moment.
And I mean, offsetting is such a fraught topic and methodology. I think. I mean, we had here. I've got to do more research into it and talk to an expert on it. But one of the ways Australia is going to offset the massive development in natural gas here is to sort of purchase it was either Zambia, I think it was Zambia, the forest in Zambia. So it's just a way to do nothing. It's a way to do absolutely nothing.
I don't think it's bad for global north countries to invest in sort of protecting and creating a mechanism to value habitats in the global south, but that shouldn't be as a mitigation for doing more harm, because otherwise we're just going to pump all that natural gas into the atmosphere. The climate's going to change, and those rainforests are going to burn down because you've reached this tipping point. I mean, tropical rainforests don't burn, but they are now burning because they're becoming dry enough to do so.
The depressing thing, and again we're straying a little bit off the state of the world's birds, but it's intrinsically.
These are all fundamental reasons.
That's right. It's intrinsically linked to some of these topics, like infrastructure for one and climate change for another. But I get so frustrated here where without peer in Australia, the largest exporter of natural gas to the rest of the world. We're not massive consumers of it here. We're sending it all everywhere else. And the common line in the media is that it's underpinning the strength of our economy, etc., etc. And that's just the line that is continually parroted. But once in a while, they'll bring someone on to point out how destructive it will be. But it's always framed that they don't say, here's the crazy loony who wants to ruin your life. But that's always the way it gets presented. Like, they'll bring on someone who'll not rant and rave, but be a little bit more animated than most commentators
that's exactly the same thing happens here. So UK government basically recently green-lighted more exploration of essentially North Sea. Well, in this case, it's really Atlantic oil off the west coast of Shetland, basically. And they said, right, we've got this cost of living crisis here. A lot of that's been driven by rising energy prices, especially the price of gas, linked to conflicts around the world. And they said, right, this is going to lower the energy crisis for British citizens. Except it's just not true, because that energy is sold on global markets, and it will negligibly influence the price of gas here. And every time we open up a new oil field, it reduces demand to come up with a solution to these crises. It just mandates they continue happening. And we know, we gotta leave these fossil fuels in the ground and work out a way of weaning ourselves off them. And in Britain, there's a crisis of heating our homes, and our homes are massively, massively inefficient at retaining warmth, compared to homes in Scandinavia. And it's just fundamentally obvious things we can do to not use all the gas we're using to heat our homes. And there was 10 years ago a big push by government to try and insulate homes, and then the money was pulled from that. And now, we know we need to. What's important is we need to, have more gas rather than make homes, more insulated. And same with travel and all these things. And there's really obvious solutions. There's solutions to the housing crisis, which precipitates this, cost of living crisis, which offsets the food crisis. And there's ways and means, there's pipelines to do this, but they all interfere with the status quo and the interests of the powerful people in maintaining the current status quo which lines their pockets. But we've got solutions. That's the main thing. We're not acting in a vacuum of having nothing to do with holding a hand up. We know what to do.
You're sounding very woke, Alex.
Very worried.
Very woke.
I am. I am worried. It's infuriating when you just see, again, you see these lines being parroted when we've got the ways and means to work ourselves out of these crises.
I wanted to bring in energy, just by way of being able to then ask you whether you determined or have some idea other than anecdotal thoughts about the infrastructure that is being developed for green technology, particularly the wind turbines, but also, as is happening more often, the expansive solar farms that is being put on pasture and degraded farmlands in a lot of cases. So how much of an impact are those two types of infrastructure having on birds now?
All right. So everything, any way we're going to produce energy is going to impact the natural world.
That's right.
So there's no getting away from that.
Yeah.
There's no getting away from the fact if you site a wind farm at a major migration bottleneck for raptors, that's a really, really stupid idea, and you'll kill a lot of species, and you could have population impacts on that, and you could even drive species to extinction depending on where those things were. It's also true that you can site wind farms in an area where they have a relatively negligible impact on biodiversity. Solar farms as well. There's if you're planting, you shouldn't solar farms shouldn't be located on what we call sort of grade A agricultural land. The areas which are best to produce food. We should use those to produce food, because we could easily hit a major crisis in providing food for the world's population quite soon, given projections under climate change and failure to close yield gaps or decreasing yield and everything else. So, there's massive scope for putting solar, having a sort of a delocalized energy economy and having solar on everyone's homes, notwithstanding the how much raw materials we have and other issues surrounding lithium and mines and electric cars and everything else. There are major challenges there, but I think you compare that to the sort of status quo and the threat that climate change poses to species extinctions far exceeds the impacts from renewables, for instance. And it's actually a bit of a talking point in the denial paper, because often people focus then, they'll say, oh, you've got an extinction crisis, and they'll say, well, it's white-tailed eagles being killed by wind farms in Norway. And that probably is happening, but we should build wind farms in areas where they're not going to impact white-tailed eagles, and then we, by and large, solve that problem. I even saw someone posted on Twitter on the thread for this link for this thing that mentioned wind farms, and it can be a problem, but they are absolutely part of the solution in a way that fossil fuels aren't, and need to be phased out, basically.
I haven't seen that because I was probably asleep when that went on, but I'm guessing that might have been Hamish who has a particular concern about wind farms in Western Victoria and killing our crane here, the brolga. But I think
we have to have very good environmental impact assessments, and if there's evidence they're going to be a problem, then you need to make sure that doesn't happen there, and that historically hasn't happened in many areas, and we can't afford to be wiping out species with wind farms, and we don't need to. You can cite these areas where they'll have a negligible impact. When I say negligible, I don't mean they're going to not kill birds, but I mean they're not going to cause population level impacts on birds, and that's the currency. It's not. They may well go there, and you see a lot of dead birds, but are these population level impacts? That's the key thing we need to deal with, because the alternatives are species extinctions, basically. And you think about and the level of. I mean, another question is what kills birds where, right? I often see a lot of whataboutery on this. Like the cat people will say, well, when it's not the cats. It's not important that cats are killing birds or whatever. Or the wind farm people will say, oh well, wind farms kill way fewer birds than cats do. Or the building people will say this and what that. But it's always context dependent, and it's what bird species are being killed where and what proportion of the population. And often there are ways and means of keeping all these people. It's like don't build massive skyscrapers with reflective glass which shows trees and sky on it. Keep your cats indoors, or put some massive collar which stops them moving or whatever, and don't build wind farms on migration superhighways. And again, there's fixes to these things, but people often get this whataboutery and false equivalence and everything else coming up.
I also we touched on earlier on that there's always the people who say we don't need to worry about it because we'll tech our way out of it,
Yeah.
Someone like Elon will fix it. But then I'm thinking, hang on, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So it's possible to keep your cats inside, to mitigate the problem of bird strike and collisions with reflective surfaces. We could turn our lights off at night in places where it's not necessary, and we could site infrastructure in a proper in a less harmful place, and we could remove harmful chemicals from the environment, and we could also try to control invasive species.
Yeah,
we could actually do those things and not wait for Elon Musk to turn his attention to biodiversity loss after he's finished taking us to Mars.
Yeah, no. Precisely, and well said. I mean, the energy conservation thing is it's such a no-brainer. Turning lights off at night, but our skylines are continuously full of lights, and people then talk about, well, it's a women's health issue, but it's only a women's health issue because men are horrendous and need to behave, and that's a behaviour change thing. It shouldn't be that women are gatekept from going out at night because of men, or need to walk in bright spaces. Men need to change their behaviour, and that's just incredible. We still live in a world where that's the case. So you always look at the root cause of the problem and not some intermediate thing. And again, there's lots of whataboutery that happens there as well when it comes to lights at night, I think, etc. And I think we just need to take a much deeper look at all the variables involved there. And often it comes down to the crunch of it. You can fix all these problems why we ended up having lights on at night, and we actually don't need them at all. And that comes to all sorts of conservation when it terms of resources, not just turning lights off, but not having vast amounts of food waste, which we do globally. Maybe upwards of 60% of all food produced is never eaten, and that's spoilage in the global south, and that's people chucking stuff, or spoilage before things get to the plate in the global south, and that's stuff never being eaten in the global north. It's it's bought and thrown away, for instance. We need to be reducing all these things there, and all of that increases overconsumption of energy and of food and all these things as well. So there's some relatively easy fixes. It just requires sort of behaviour changes by all of us as well. But it's the status quo is to sell more food, right? To more people. I mean, how can if you're a company that produces food, how do you grow? I mean, it's our economy is based on perpetual growth, and if your population isn't growing, you've suddenly got a way to get them to buy more food, and that's more of anything, right? It comes back to I forget what the economist term is for perceived redundancy and planned redundancy of goods, right? You have to buy a new iPhone because you perceive the old, or it's your iPhone you bought, it's got some kill switch or whatever that means it stops working after so many years, and you can't find someone to repair it or whatever else. So that's this idea of planned obsolescence.
Planned obsolescence, yeah. Look, before we get to some silver lining stuff, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the drivers of extinction is something that I hadn't really put my mind to so much. I mean, I've thought about the fringe issues around it so much, but global trade teleconnections. Flesh that out a little bit for us, please, Alex.
Yeah, so this is actually, we touched on this right at the beginning there, and we talked about global south versus global north, and we think about it. I mean, the rivers in the UK, well, they were clean like 10 years ago until we privatised most of our utilities here, and that meant there was been no investment, and they're now all full of shit. And that's
hold on just a moment. I have to get this one in. Hello, Fergal Sharkey.
Yes, fantastic. Yeah, so we've had campaigners like Fergal pushing. Anglers have been all on top of this because there's no fish left in the rivers because they're full of shit. So I remember where I'm going here. So our rivers were at a point where they were quite clean. The reason why they were quite clean is because all heavy industry had all been moved elsewhere. Globalization meant that we now buy everything from China. China's polluting its own rivers to produce stuff that we can import. Our rivers are clean. The same is true of agriculture, right? And there's this land abandonment happening in Eastern Europe, return of wildlife, because now we're outsourcing our environmental impact. And this idea that we need to recognize the role of the global north in outsourcing its environmental costs is driving massive loss of habitat, and driving extinctions and declines of species in the global south, which often has the richer biodiversity. And getting that and making sure that we're not importing deforestation is a massive priority. And there's sort of initiatives like Trace Earth, sort of Stockholm Environment Institute, for instance, a friend of mine, Toby Gardner, that sort of largely behind that efforts that trying to track commodity flows and show, well, this is the impact, and how your hot dog you buy on the streets of Manchester, that is sort of imported deforestation from Brazil via via some intermediary of some pig in the Low Countries or whatever it is, in Holland, and these commodity flows and the choices of the things we buy and what we put on the plate sort of echo across the planet in terms of deforestation and land use change.
I mean, the scale is just so large, isn't it? But then I think about how we hear of, biodiversity. Rewind. Diabetes in the Western population, heart disease, complications related to too much salt, the general health effects of being obese. We can solve so many problems by also doing something which is biodiversity positive if we had the coordinated will to do it. And I know I'm shouting into the wind when I say this, but industries reach the end of their life. As we move on with technology or socially, just what's normally accepted changes. Some industries end. And I wish we had some leaders in the political field anywhere in the world that would stand up to capitalism and the capacities of industry and say, your industry has 15 years to go. Start, if you want your company to survive, look for something else.
Yeah.
In fact, I'd actually prefer that they nationalised everything and got rid of the bad things, but don't tell anyone. But there just seems to be no willingness anywhere. I mean, I can't think of anywhere in the world where people are actually planning to phase out harmful industries.
Yeah. Well, I guess we're starting down that road. I mean, in health-wise in this country, so we've got socialised healthcare. So our healthcare provider, the NHS, is very keen on people being healthier because then the less money needs to be spent. Whereas you can arguably say in other parts of the world, the more unhealthy people are, the better the business model is. So
we have the same. And sorry to interrupt, but I think I see the same thing in terms of everyone's promoting good health.
Yeah.
But no one's connecting the reason for the bad health and what could be joined to it that could be nature positive without having to be offsetting.
I think the key here then, so I mean, in recent decades then, you buy sweets or whatever here, or something that's unhealthy, it's got a score, it says red or it's green or it's orange, and it tells you something about whether this thing is good for you. And there's also been the start of moves towards sort of sugar taxes and such like here, the idea that you're going to pay more for something which is worse for your health. So hopefully that should push us into a more healthy space. So that also depends on lifestyle, right? And then there's also talk here of 4-day working weeks and volunteerism and ways that people might be more active and have more time to be more active and to be healthier. With food as well, then, it would be great if you knew the environmental cost of the food you're eating and not just the health cost. It would be great if we priced food accordingly. So I switched to being sort of vegetarian about a decade ago, and that was a long time after, I was eating very nice organic Brazilian beef, which is the driver of the extinction crisis I was researching for a very long time. And that's sort of cognitive dissonance, isn't it, in a way? But I eventually, when I was out in Brazil, stopped eating beef and then phased out most of the meats. I'm still eating roadkill deer in the US and other stuff with a very low environmental impact. And there's some stuff I would, if it was low environmental impact and reasonably high welfare, I wouldn't have a problem. But we don't price that here according to that. You go to a restaurant and the vegetarian option costs the same as the meat option. Indeed, it must be subsidizing. Or more, and it must be massively subsidizing it because it's obviously cheaper and it obviously comes with a lower environmental cost. And if you had that range of stuff, and especially if that stuff was nice, it wasn't just really horrible food, sometimes it can be as well, then people would switch. And it's often the carrot is much better than the stick, rather than sort of beating people over the head with it. If it just costs less and it's nice, then people will do that, and they'll be healthier. There'll be less environmental damage. You pay more for high welfare, high environmental value animal foodstuffs, and there's scope to do that as well. It just can't be the volume we're currently producing at. So I think there are solutions there, and they're environmentally and socially just solutions. It's just annoying. We don't seem to be getting there, or it is going very, very slowly towards that goal. And we're being held back from that by a torrent of denialism from some quarters, or false equivalents, and sometimes that comes from industry, sometimes that comes from individual farmers. But I also see in farmers recognizing these challenges, and farmers will grow what we ask them to grow, and we've still got to produce food to feed billions of people. So we just need to change the way we're doing that in a socially environmentally just fashion, and make sure that people can afford to eat well. And it's not impossible, but it does require potentially divorcing us from this cycle of perpetual economic growth which got us into the problem where we are in the first place.
I mean, a massive thing that would change or would shift the needle, I think, would just be that accounting for the general biodiversity cost, environmental cost, climate change cost, negative impact on every product, and that cost having to be passed on, not to be fudged and hidden in other parts of either the company, the product cycle, or the economy generally, would change behaviour.
Yeah.
But again, nobody has the courage to actually implement it.
And it requires full life cycle analysis as well. I mean,
That's right.
There's products you see being sold which are sort of we're told are bad or good for the environment, and sometimes you look at the full life cycle cost, it's not true. Like, for instance, the little coffee pots or whatever, and was like, oh god, these are terrible because you can't recycle them. But actually, you end up producing less coffee, and there's actually not a lot of material there, and theoretically they are recyclable. Whereas often people make like a massive vat of coffee and throw it away, and therefore we need to use more land to produce more coffee in the global south. And drive more deforestation. So sometimes stuff can be a bit surprising about when you actually look at the full life cycle of products, and that can shock us even into thinking that some of these decisions weren't the best ones. And in some cases, like you sort of here in the UK, everything used to be served in glass bottles. You know, you got Coca-Cola in a glass bottle in the 60s, and it was recycled, and then we went from there to everything being in plastic bottles, and we were in a better place in the 1960s than we are now. And now people are just talking about recycling bottles again. But we've been there, it worked before. But for some reason, because of either cost saving or because people decided they couldn't be bothered, we ended up doing something which was more detrimental. So it's amazing.
Or the great con with plastic, where the meat tray that you buy your sausages or whatever on has something that looks like the recycled triangle, but it doesn't have the arrows. So they were stamping, and still are, a whole lot of plastic products so that they appear to be recyclable, but they're not. But the consumer thinks they're doing the right thing by buying this and putting it in the curbside recycling. And for listeners around the world, I do understand that it's a position of privilege that we're speaking from here, where we do have curbside recycling, and some things are being recycled. But all these trays and whatnot that are not recyclable, they are being crushed up into great pellets, and they're either being burned in warehouse fires, or, until recently, I mean, we were shipping them to Malaysia and China. Now, I think those countries have said no. So we're probably shipping them somewhere else now. And these are the things that I get annoyed about. We know it's happening. Our recycling facade program here that was called the RED, that you take your soft plastics back to the supermarkets and they would be recycled. That was what we were all sold. But nothing was recycled. It was all taken away and stored in warehouses. They're not recycling it. No, okay. It's too hard. It's too expensive. I wonder what we could do. I know. Stop packaging the items we want to buy in that shit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's too hard. No, it's not too hard. Just bloody somebody do it.
Yeah, we've had that massive scandals here over recycling when things that have been ostensibly recycled, they've gone to the recycle bin, they've gone to a place, and then they've been shipped off to somewhere in the global south, and
or just dumped in landfill on the quiet, illegally.
Dumped in landfill in the global south. I think a lot of it. Yeah. So I think that's just again, it's exporting our problems and rivers full of plastics there, and we need to be reducing their usage here and creating a system where people can obtain food and don't need to do these things, and that's the way to go. And places like Germany are really leading on this, and in the UK we're still a long way behind, although it's sort of emerging now as an issue, and people are demanding that we get better at it.
Well, that'll open up a whole new discussion. What are the bits of silver linings that you discovered? And any rainbows that you could point to?
Yeah, conservation works, right? I mean, it works in all sorts of examples. It's worked in the UK and in Europe, where we've invested in creating wetlands. We've brought wetland birds back in high bioabundance. Not sustainable hunting and offtake works. If you can have offtake of species if it's sustainable, and you can create models that numbers go up, like Ducks Unlimited in the States, whatever. People own the system, then you can reverse the damage done by some of these extractive activities for biodiversity. We've shown that we've avoided extinctions through last-minute conservation interventions. There's point-based sort of bright spots, evidence of conservation schemes, which might be blueprints for major changes that also work. So there is plenty to be optimistic about, but it's in so many cases the political will to get these things happening, basically at large enough spatial scales to have an impact, basically. So I think it's all the things we've talked about is this portfolio solutions. We just need to make sure they're implemented as fast as possible.
Well, let's go to the conclusions in the report, and I just want to read one sentence and then get you to comment on it, because it really sums up all of my frustrations. A lack of progress in conserving these species, and that's everything that was mentioned in the report, usually reflects a lack of resources or political will, rather than a lack of knowledge of what needs to be done. And that's it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It sort of funds up what we've been discussing for the last couple of hours, and especially what I just said in the last minute or so. We do know what to do. We just need to have the space to operate in to be able to do those things.
Are you optimistic that things will change quick enough? And I might just say to people who are watching live, it's a good time to start thinking about some comments or questions, because after we've talked about the general provisioning or feeding of wildlife, we'll launch into.
Yeah, well, to say I've only got 15 minutes though before I have to see a student, so we might have to.
We'll just quickly do that, and maybe Alex, I probably get you back to just talk about.
I'm happy to
feeding.
Talk about. Yeah, maybe we can do that as a separate one then.
Yeah. So we might just talk about it broadly in general. I've got. I actually thought there was. I must have been an hour out in my time conversion, was I? It's I must have been.
Quarter to 5.
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry for the podcast listeners who are going, stop talking about stuff that doesn't matter to us at the moment.
I thought it was a pretty useful discussion.
For sure. I mean, it's just so big, and I was really concerned about how we would actually tackle having the conversation and trying to cram so much into it, because it is such a we know it's a massive problem, and there's just so many examples we haven't even talked about, and so many really interesting examples of disasters on the one hand that could have been circumvented. But then there's so many success stories, and we need to be able to talk about some more of those in detail. But let's talk now quickly in the last little bit of time you have. I'm going to put it to you in the form of a yes or no kind of question, and let's take it away from the broader landscape for a minute, because I know we need to talk about vultures and so many other things. We'll have a different show about that. But feeding birds and wildlife in the garden, in the home garden generally, or and parks and places where people go, pondages, feeding, yes or no?
Well, yeah, difficult to say if on a binary level, but it's got to change. That will be my simple answer. I actually ended up on the BBC breakfast sofa with actually that same question, and having an audience of 8 million, and I'm like, really don't. My worry is, like, if we pulled the plug on bird feeding in some British cities, you could lose house sparrow, which ironically enough we're very worried about the conservation status of, because it's declined massively. However, there's emerging evidence from especially from the UK that bird feeding is precipitating major changes in bird populations, and maybe the biggest drivers of declines in some. In fact, it's not even a maybe. It is the biggest driver of declines in some species because of disease, but it could be the biggest drivers of declines in other species because of those competitive interactions we talked about, right? Species don't exist in isolation. They exist in an ecosystem with other species, and bird feeding, providing resources, means the populations of some species can go up, and that might be great if they're orange-bellied parrots or there's something which is declining because they no longer have resources in their environment, and we're providing replacement resources for them. Even in the case in the UK of farmland bird species, which they're increasingly sterile agricultural landscapes, and they have this hungry gap where hit February and there's no food left and they're dying then. So providing food might be a stopgap. It's not where we should be, right? We should have landscapes which can provide food for these things year round, but in the short term, we probably need to do that because otherwise we might lose them. However, when generalized provisioning, providing resources for animals, affects all sorts of species, it can tip the balance of this naturally evolved competition. And that's what we're finding, or we think we're finding in the UK, because we're seeing the populations of some generalists going up and the population of some specialists going down. And the reason the specialists are going down is because of the interactions they're having with the generalists. Now, this is kind of a new thing for the UK because we've slowly ratcheted up feeding here. It's become like something that everyone does. You're never more than a couple hundred meters from a bird feeder. We're putting out 150 million tons of bird food every year. It's a vast amount of provisioning, and that translates into big changes in populations. It enhances disease transmission. Comes back to the rodenticides we talked about, because a lot of the food is eaten by brown rats and house mice, and then people don't want to feed those. They want to feed nice birds, so they put out poison for the rodents, and that poison is then biomagnified up the food chain and then drives declines in other bird species. In Australia and New Zealand, there's NGOs there usually talk about not feeding because you've got very clear examples of the competition there. Thinking about things like noisy miners, for instance, which can monopolize
rainbow
those resources, rainbow lorikeets, and drive down population. So you guys have got some really clear examples about that. They're less clear than the examples that we've got here with like blue and great tits, for instance. But that evidence is now emerging simply because when our subordinate species, the species which lose those battles over resources, things like marsh willow tits, we've done all the number crunching, and there's nothing else that seems to be the problem. So for these willow tits, they're primary cavity excavators. They go and they dig nest cavities, and they're losing these cavities to blue and great tits, which take them over basically. And the populations of blue and great tits are massively increased, like 40% for great tits. And so they're losing out on this battle for resources. And these subordinate species, they have all these sort of things they do, specialist behaviors to compete. And often feeding undermines those specialist behaviors, like providing nest boxes, for instance, or marsh tits and coal tits and willow tits. They hoard food. They bury food in the winter, which means you get a cold winter, the blue and great tits should die, but they don't. There's always a bird feeder. And so and then they defend year-round territories. And the blue and great tits just leave the woods. They go to suburbia. They eat bird food, come back, steal the nests of these species, compete with them for caterpillars, etc. So you can't change the dynamics of an ecosystem without having these cascading impacts. And in the UK, because there's so many people that really like feeding birds, because it's the number one thing we do to connect with nature, we seem to be fundamentally altering the dynamics of competition between bird species, in addition to creating this perfect storm of disease transmission, which has meant that populations of some really love garden birds like greenfinches have just absolutely tanked. That's happening to chaffinches now as well. And what's the next species? Like hawfinches. There was even a call put out by the RSPB, the largest conservation NGO like in Europe practically, to stop feeding birds around some places in North Wales, because these hawfinches, much rarer species, were all catching this Trichomonas galleni, this parasite which was getting transferred at bird feeders. The RSPB then hasn't said, you should stop feeding all other species of birds, even though the greenfinch declined by almost 70% in England. We lost millions of them because of a disease caught at bird feeders. So I think we need a much more deeper soul searching about reducing disease transmission risk and thinking about these cascading impacts through ecosystems. It really should be, rather than encouraging people to this sort of capitalist stopgap, if you like, well, we'll fix wildlife by buying stuff for wildlife. Let's make habitat in people's gardens for wildlife.
That was. I'm glad you mentioned that, because every Saturday morning, 9:30 a.m. Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, Hobart time, we do live habitat gardening talk, because I'm looking for a way, and I'm wondering if you can see a way that is apparent for people to maintain that connection or grow that connection, that fundamental connection with wildlife. And to be able to reduce the feeding of birds and other wildlife, and so that we can maintain the positive human aspect of the interaction while reducing as much as possible the negatives, especially the disease transmission and the competition aspects.
So I think the key here is to ask we're using birds and wildlife interchangeably here. We're using feeder using birds and wildlife, right? I can go my neighborhood here. They're like people with like plastic lawns, literally not a single live thing, and they've got a couple of bird feeders up. And so for them, they're doing their bit, but they are helping populations of some very common bird species. You could change that garden into a diverse ecosystem with lots of native species, and you've got 4,000 species of animals and plants in your tiny little garden, because wildlife isn't just the blue tits, it's everything else. And then you've got a functioning ecosystem, and you can have a payoff then of having planted teasels and having goldfinches coming to land on your teasels, eat those teasel seeds. They're not there. You don't get that payoff year round, right? Unless you can create the habitats and the species in that garden for those species to be always there, like they would be if you were feeding Niger seed or something, which has been grown in West Africa. You're importing sort of deforestation to provide food for common bird species in Europe. So I think changing the way we see that and thinking about all wildlife and the complexity of habitats, and not necessarily having that constant payoff of having your favorite birds in your garden all the time, but building ecosystems, from the bottom up, rather than just having a quick, easy fix of a bird feeder and a couple of common species. And this vast. Gardens are a very large part of the total acreage of the British countryside. So, sort of less so where you are, but there's a real scope to do really well here. But we're sort of failing on that, and people are concreting over these areas and not spending time. And maybe that's because of demands of work and everything else, or connection with nature, or whatever it is. But you need to create that environment that people are motivated to not just have a couple of exotic species or a plastic lawn, but to have a vibrant space for wildlife that they're managing. And for me, I get fewer of some species now, but the payoff in having invested in habitat creation and seeing wild native species coming in and using your habitats much more than that short-term fix of putting a feeder up and getting a load of common birds on it.
Alex, how about we do a habitat gardening with Alex Lees on a 9:30 a.m. Saturday morning in Britain one morning?
I'd be very happy to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll work that out. There's a good jumping off point for us to end. Alex, it's been a fantastic discussion. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot, as I knew I would. I'd like to acknowledge some of the live listeners. Birdling a Bird, thank you for your great podcast. Thank you for your kind words. And Joe, I know Joe was on the Bird Strike one a few weeks ago, so great. Thanks so much. I do try and pick really cool guests and really interesting guests and great communicators, and Alex referenced his BBC appearance and some of his other media things. Look him up. I'll link quite a few of them. Alex is a great communicator, and I thank you for the work you've been doing, Alex, and being a tireless warrior for the cause.
Oh, standing on the shoulders of giants, as always. I mean, lots and lots of partners and collaborators across the world. So often done a lot more work than I have, and a lot of these papers I'm involved with.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the thing is, the work's got to get done. The research has got to be done. Someone's got to collect the data. But as I always say, you can have the best research in the world, but if it's sitting in a journal article behind a paywall, then the people who can affect change don't even know about it. So
yep.
Your role is crucial. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching and listening. We'll have Alex back on to talk about, in detail, more about gardening and feeding and habitat creation.
Even water holes in Africa. I've actually got to speak to a project student about that in 2 minutes. But that's another facet of that that will hopefully whet audiences' appetites for understanding how water hole creation precipitates changes to community structure and such like.
Well, I'll be actually asking you for a whole lot of people that you think I should talk to about so many of these issues, and we will do that in the time to come. Thanks so much for your time, Alex.
Thank you, Grant. It's been great.
And I look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks, everyone, for being with us on The Bird Emergency. TheBirdEmergency.com/YouTube is where you can find everything that's coming up before it gets into the audio feed. See you all. Well, you'll hear us next time. Bye.